Morning. Morning, everyone. Welcome, welcome to the 2018 Apollo 50th Anniversary Moon Seminar. This is a special series. We are so glad that you are with us today. Carl? First, all the people coordinated. So many special movies. Why is also our faculty and staff and administration and supporting this effort and having this event here at Angelo State University. And I'd like to thank all of our guests for being here today as well. Well, since this is our first speaker at 9 o'clock, we'll begin with our first event, is that we actually will have our student coordinators will introduce our guests throughout this today and also tomorrow. Our first speaker is Mr. Francis French from San Diego, and Hilario will provide the introduction for that. Hilario is a senior in our communication and mass media department. So let's please give Hilario and all of our student coordinators a good hand.
Thank you, thank you. Well, good morning and welcome to the 50th Apollo Moon Landing Program. We're very excited to host every single distinguished individual and keep the memory of the moon landing alive. This portion of the Apollo seminar is brought to you by Suddenlink, our official sponsor. Now to our first guest. He is a book and magazine author, as you can see here. He served as a former director of events for the Sally Ride Museum and also worked as a director of education for the San Diego Air and Space Museum. So I would like everybody here to give a heartwarming and friendly West Texas welcoming to Mr. Francis French.
Thank you very much. It's wonderful to be here. Can you folks see the screen okay from where you're sitting? Because you don't want to be looking at me so much as the pictures behind me, so as long as you can see okay. Great. It's very excited to be here. I understand this is being streamed, so I just want to make a disclaimer that everything I'm saying is anecdotal and sort of based on memories of books I wrote 10 years ago, so if you're writing a paper on this based on what I'm saying, you'd probably fail, so don't trust anything. The great thing is, right after this, we're having a panel of the Apollo folks who are actually there. So you're really going to hear direct from the source of people who were there, what it was like to land on the moon and what they saw. So trust them a lot more than me. But what I wanted to do is try and take you through some things this morning, take you up to that moment of the first moon landing, because a lot of people don't understand what it took for America to get to the moon. It was actually a lot more convoluted a story a lot more interesting a story than a lot of people know. Where I've been working in San Diego at the Air and Space Museum, you know, it's a big retired military town. We get a lot of seniors come by on tours, and most of them spend way too long talking about whatever plane it was they used to fly. And we get groups like this, but this is kind of a special group. On the left-hand side there in the pink shirt, you've got the last person to step foot on the moon, Gene Cernan. In the middle there in the yellow shirt, you've got Neil Armstrong, first person to set foot on the moon. You've got the whole crew of the people who went to the moon first there. And these guys look like the kind of people you might pass by in the street all the time, but it's actually a very special group of people, because only 24 people so far have ever made that journey to the moon and back again. And if you talk to these guys, the "and back again" part of that sentence is really, really important. It's a very, very important part of history. It's a time we haven't done again, we hadn't done since, in just 4 years. Went from one of these things to the other. So how did that happen? Let's go back to a picture of Neil Armstrong. We're going to talk a bit about Neil Armstrong, and we're very lucky to have Jim Hansen with us today, who wrote the book First Man. You're going to learn a lot about Neil, but let's look at this picture, because I want to talk a little bit about why people were going to the moon, and a lot of it was done through pictures like this. We've got an image here of a guy wearing a spacesuit with an American flag on the shoulder, sort of prominently turned towards the camera with the moon behind him. Kind of looks like a medieval knight in armor ready to suit up and go fight, and that's kind of what it was. This was a propaganda war with the Soviet Union. This was a war of images and a war of ideas. No operational reason for Neil Armstrong to be wearing that spacesuit that day, but in terms of what this represented, is a kind of a very heroic image. So remember this image. We'll get back to how Neil Armstrong was very different from this image a little bit later on. Soviet Union were doing the same kind of thing. Soviet Union were actually the first country to put anybody into space. Yuri Gagarin, as you can see, his country gave him just 1 or 2 medals after he got back. And Yuri is one of those faces that you can see. You know, at the time, Americans, I think, saw the Soviet Union as, you know, it was always images were in sort of a grainy black and white, and it was considered very austere and very scary. You see a picture like this, it's a good-looking guy in his 20s, smiling in color, and it actually did a lot to change people's perceptions of the Soviet Union in the West, because they thought, this guy looks nice, this guy looks friendly. That was exactly what the Soviet Union were going for. They were hoping to win the war of propaganda, not only by flying in space first, but by flying somebody who would represent their idea of their country as youthful, as friendly. This was a time where you didn't really want to have a war with nuclear weapons. What you wanted to do was have a war on the front pages, and images like this and that one of Neil Armstrong was kind of how that was done. And you look at images like this, the Soviets put out of Yuri Gagarin. You know, this is a country that has no state religion, that actually was not interested in having any religion. And you look at a picture like this, they've almost sort of sanctified him here, made him look like a saint. Very much what they wanted to do, very much what they wanted to try and do to get their image across. This is my hometown of Manchester, England, which was about 3 minutes from nuclear annihilation if the Russians decided to all launch at once. And America was about 12 minutes away, so basically if England had gone up in flames, it would have been your call to all go down into the bunkers, so we would have been your crash test dummy in that kind of way. No reason to love the Soviet Union. On a very rainy day, he's the enemy of the country. He's wearing a Soviet military uniform, and yet you can see people are standing 6 or 12 people deep in the pouring rain. But America wasn't going to wait around for that. You know, you think about how many tens of thousands of years people have been looking at the stars, how many hundreds of years people have been writing about going into space. The difference in time between the Soviet Union and America putting a person into space was 3 weeks. Tiny, tiny fraction of time, and yet one was first and one was second, and that's really what was mattered at that time. Who did it first? So America put their first person in space 3 weeks after the Russians. Alan Shepard was on this relatively tiny rocket. It was powerful enough to get him high enough to say he was in space, but it wasn't powerful enough to keep him there. He came right back down again for a 15-minute flight. Nothing like what they can do today, very, very simple. And yet, America was in the space race, and the race was on. Before that, America had to choose what kind of people were going to go into space, and a lot of ideas went back and forward. Should we send daring people like mountain climbers, deep-sea divers? Should we send people who are used to very weird situations like trapeze artists or gymnasts or people that can tumble around? Maybe people had no idea what space was going to be like. They thought maybe you get up into space and you look out the window and you look off into the vastness of space and maybe people would start going crazy. Of course, we know that's not true. I mean, you can go outside at night and look up into the vastness of space, so it's not that big a deal. But at the time, nobody had any idea. They also had no idea what would happen to people in space if they try to eat or drink, or whether it would affect their breathing. No idea. So what they decided to do was choose people who had already been in very extreme flying situations. So they chose test pilots, the kind of people who were testing out new planes, and when you were turning them upside down, doing all kinds of crazy things with a brand new plane that nobody knew quite what the limit was of this airplane, these guys would be very calmly and methodically either noting on their knee pads or reading back on the radio the numbers of what this airplane was doing, the tolerances. Very dangerous job, but you had to be very calm and collected. So they chose test pilots. They were all white men. That at the time, America did not have any women who were doing any kind of jet piloting in the military, never mind test piloting. So that's why you only see men at this time. That did change later on. So here's an image, you know, it wasn't just the Soviets doing propaganda. Here is an image that's only done for propaganda purposes by the Americans. And you still see this on the front cover of, in Barnes & Noble, you walk in and there's an anniversary book about something. They still use this image because it's so powerful. These 7 guys were chosen to fly a single-seater spacecraft. So there's no reason why you would suit up 7 of them on one day. And yet, this is what they did for this incredible image, because it really does look like 7 Cold War warriors about to go and fight in their sort of suits of armor. And a very, very powerful image. If you look a little closer, though, you kind of see that the budget wasn't quite that big in those days, because you've got like a high school gym bench behind them and a bit of blue paper, just like every kind of prom picture you've ever seen. Very, very cheap setup. And you look even closer at the boots, the ones in the middle there are different from the others. They didn't actually have enough silver spacesuit boots to go around. So they took some black boots and they spray painted them silver and kind of thought, well, maybe nobody would notice. But this was nevertheless what America was trying to do, trying to get this image across. And it worked very well. So with just that 3 weeks of spaceflight experience, you know, that 3 weeks between those 2 flights, and with just 15 minutes of spaceflight experience in this country, President Kennedy decided to make a very, very bold announcement. He said, by the end of this decade, America's going to land a man on the moon and bring him safely back to Earth. And the people at NASA were quite shocked. I mean, how are they going to do that? They were able to put somebody in space for a quarter of an hour. So how are they going to get to send somebody to the moon? There was a very good reason for doing this. Kennedy talked to his advisors, and he was told, if you want to beat the Russians, you've got to come up with something that America can achieve before them. The trouble was the Russians were very secretive about what they were doing. Nobody knew what the rockets looked like. Nobody knew what the spacecraft looked like. They only really knew what the people looked like. So had they said, we're going to put a space station up before the Russians could have put up a slightly bigger spacecraft, said it was a space station, and nobody would really know. So the goal had to be something so audacious, so outrageous, so out there, that there was no way that anybody really had a lead. Both countries would be starting from the start line, essentially. So Kennedy was told the moon would be the best thing to do. And so that's what he did. NASA had no idea how to do this, but they knew they had to get going right away to make this happen. Before they could get really going, though, the Russians had another coup on their hands. They decided to send German Titov, the gentleman on the left here, into space for over a day. I mean, he went up into space, he fell asleep, had a nighttime, woke up again, carried on going. This was a very, very long flight, really impressive. By comparison, when America was able to send up John Glenn, who's on the right there, the first American to orbit the Earth, he got up there, and almost immediately they started thinking something's going wrong with the spacecraft. The heat shield appeared to be loose. Something was not correct, and so he had to be brought down way earlier than a day. There were some technical issues they had to solve. So America was getting closer to what the Russians were doing. They were able to put people into orbit, but they were still nowhere near what the Russians were able to do with endurance in space. But there was something about John Glenn that was a little bit different. I mean, he really does have that kind of all-American apple pie hero kind of look to him, and a very, very clean-cut guy. I mean, he met his wife when they were both in kindergarten, and the only thing that separated them was just the other year, one of them died when they were both in their 90s. So I mean, that is a long, it's about the longest sort of term, lifelong relationship you can imagine. The guy was a decorated military pilot. He was an astronaut. He was a senator. His whole life was public service. So exactly who you want sort of on the front pages to represent America in a kind of a propaganda war like this. The Russians were not going to wait around on that one, though. They had the ability to launch their spacecraft precisely at any time they wanted to, through any kind of weather. Just press the button and it would go. They didn't really have to have the kind of delays that this country was having in terms of rocket launches. So they thought, well, we could send one person up in one spacecraft and exactly the right moment launch another one, and those two spacecraft would kind of come pretty close to each other, which is an amazing technical achievement. But what the Russians did was make people think they had even more, because as these two spacecraft grew very close to each other, the West assumed that they had a rendezvous capability. They had the ability to change orbit, go find each other in space, and eventually maybe even dock. They couldn't do that, and the Russians never claimed they could do that, but the Russians just kind of never denied it. And so all of a sudden you see them here on the front of an American Time magazine, and the suggestion was that the Russians had this incredible rendezvousing spacecraft. So the Russians are getting headlines, the Russians are looking like they're way ahead, but they're beginning to play a little bit of a dangerous game. They're going for headlines more than they're actually going for achievements, because by doing that, the next time they fly, they've got to come up with an even bigger headline. And if you keep chasing headlines, you might not be chasing the technology as much as you need to be. But nevertheless, at this time, the Russians look like they're years ahead. America's getting kind of worried, are they ever going to catch up in time? By contrast with that flight, Gordon Cooper, the last American to launch into orbit on his own, he got up there in a single-seater spacecraft, and within a couple of orbits, his own sweat began to make the spacecraft short out. And basically, he lost all the electrical power in his spacecraft. He was able to be able to work it manually and actually brought his spacecraft down closer to the splashdown point than any astronaut had before. He was an incredibly good pilot to do that. But it kind of gave you an idea of how primitive some of the American stuff was, when your own perspiration can actually make your spacecraft die. So the Russians had this one trick. The Russians were able to launch two spacecraft at the same time and get them close to each other. They thought, well, we could do that again, but what's the point of doing that again? We're just going to get the same headline or no headline. Well, what if we put a woman in one of those spacecraft? So that's exactly what they did. They launched Valery Bykovsky there on the left, and on the right-hand side, they launched Valentina Tereshkova, the first woman in space. And you can imagine the headlines. You can imagine what the Russians did with that. It made it look like the Soviet Union was a place of equality, was a place where women were on parity with men in some of the most high-tech professions, such as piloting. It wasn't true, but it looked that way. I mentioned that America weren't choosing women as test pilots. Exactly the same thing happened in Russia. At the end of World War II, women in both Soviet Union and America who'd flown for each country were basically told, we don't need you anymore. So how did Russia choose somebody capable of flying a spacecraft? Well, their spacecraft was mostly automatic, so they didn't really need somebody who could actually touch the controls at all. What they needed was, at the very end of the flight, the spacecraft was a little too heavy to come down with somebody inside. They might have been able to survive, but they probably had a pretty bad back injury. So what they did was they popped the hatch off in the last few moments, and they parachuted them out of the side on a special kind of ejector chair. They kept that pretty secret for a long time, too. So what they needed was somebody who could parachute. So they went around the parachute clubs of the Soviet Union, and at a textile factory, they found this lady, Valentina Tereshkova, who was a textile worker and a very accomplished parachutist. And she had a great backstory as well. Her parents had been involved in World War II and been fighting for the country, and she was from a very simple, humble background. So it gave this impression that you could come from a very simple background and rise to be the first woman in space. So they put her in the spacecraft, didn't let her touch anything pretty much. Everything went great. She came back, got all the headlines, and they didn't fly another woman for 20 years. The only reason they did that was because the American space shuttle was about to fly Sally Ride, and they made her the third woman instead of the second woman. There's currently been one woman in the Russian space program, and they had one before for the last 10 years who resigned without flying. Russians really don't care that much about flying women in space, but nevertheless, they did put this first woman in space, got these huge headlines, and it looked like they were well on their way. And then something happened that we were talking about this last night. I don't know how much this changed the space program, but when JFK was assassinated, I think this is the moment that America was definitely going to go to the moon by the end of the decade, because you've been saturated with politics in the last couple of weeks, and you know that people make promises and presidents make promises, and 2-4 years later, another person comes in and says, we're not going to do any of what that person says, we're going to do something else. So JFK had been the one in 1961 to say, we're going to land on the moon. The president by 1969 may have had no interest in that whatsoever, but when it becomes an assassinated president's promise, when it becomes a martyred president's promise, something kind of changes, and it's like, we're going to do this for JFK's memory, we're going to do this for the country, this is the one thing that we're going to do that he called on us to do. So it'd be very interesting to know what would have happened if JFK had lived, whether Americans would have landed on the moon by the end of the decade. JFK was hoping to be the president to be there for that. His advisors were telling him, you could probably land on the moon by 67. So if you're a 2-term president, you'll be the guy who makes the promise at the beginning of your presidency, and you'll be the guy who welcomes back the first crew from the moon at the end of your presidency. So it made political sense to him. But who knows what would have happened? You know, the late 60s and the early 60s in this country were like two separate worlds. So this was a key moment, and for the historians among you, it would be very interesting to speculate what might have happened had he lived. So the Russians were, as I mentioned, chasing headlines, and they had an incredible one at this time. They knew Americans were only sending one person into space each time. And they knew that America was getting ready to send a 2-person spacecraft up. So what do? They put 3 people in space at one go. And it looks like they are so far ahead, looks like they've got an Apollo-like 3-person spacecraft. There's no way America could catch up with them. It really revolutionized what it looked like they were doing. And it was all another lie. It was all another fake. It wasn't a lie in terms of they did put 3 people into space, but it was a lie in terms of how they did it. What they did was they took their 1-person spacecraft and they crammed 3 people in it. So how do you do that? Basically, you can't wear spacesuits. You can't have that ejection seat capability. You've got to have a way of coming down by parachute on land, which is a lot harder than doing it in the ocean like America was doing. And you can only really stay up there for a day because your oxygen supply is going to be pretty limited. And outside of that, you've just got to hope everything goes well. It was incredibly risky. They threw away a lot of their safety procedures to do this. And the gentleman, Konstantin Fektistov, on the left, he was not a cosmonaut. He was a spacecraft designer. He'd actually been declared medically unfit to ever fly in space because he'd been shot through the stomach and left for dead by the Nazis in World War II. He was not medically in very good condition at all. But he was a leading spacecraft designer, and he said, this is crazy. I'm having no part in this. I'm not going to design this thing. So they came to him and they said, well, what if we let you fly in space and you'll become a hero of the Soviet Union and you'll get a special house on the lake and all the things that come with being a Soviet hero? And then he said, well, okay, maybe I can make this work. Maybe I can do this. So sure enough, they kind of bribed him with a space flight. And they chose a very good test pilot, Vladimir Komarov, in the middle there to pilot the spacecraft. And on the right there, you've got Boris Yegorov, who was a medical doctor. And some of the headlines they were putting out there was, finally, with more than one person in space, a doctor can do medical tests on the others. These people were so crammed together, they were in couches that were kind of above each other, and the best medical experiment he could do is reach over and take the pulse of the person below him. That was all he could do. But nevertheless, they kind of made it sound like there were all these medical tests going on. Fortunately, they survived. They all came back. But it was a close thing. So the Russians now are really going down the wrong path if they're going to get to the moon. They are creating things just for headlines. They're creating things that are going to have no other real use other than getting them on the front page of the papers. And they had one other trick up their sleeve like that too. They knew America was about to launch a 2-person spacecraft, and they knew that they were probably going to do a spacewalk on one of those very first flights. And so they wanted to get the first spacewalk in too. And they did it. And you saw pictures like this on the front pages, the Russians doing the very first spacewalk in 1965. Incredible thing. But how did they do that? Well, they had the spacecraft that was a very simple 1-person spacecraft, this kind of ball shape in the middle, and had no airlock. And it was such a simple spacecraft, you couldn't just open the hatch and expose it to zero gravity because the whole thing would just short out. So they had to create an airlock, but there was no room to launch an airlock with this rocket. So they decided to go a very dangerous but very innovative route, which is basically children's bounce houses is kind of where they went. Have you ever seen those big inflatable bounce houses? What they did was, if you look at kind of the red and blue striped bit on the side, that's an inflatable airlock. It was pushed up against the side of the spacecraft when they launched, and when they got into space, they inflated it. And Alexei Leonov, the first spacewalker, got inside, opened the hatch on the other end, and floated out into space. Again, incredibly dangerous thing to do. So many ways it could have gone wrong. So Leonov gets outside, and he's fighting his own spacesuit, because if you've ever blown up a balloon, it tries to make a sphere shape. So imagine you're in a spacesuit, and it's a very simple spacesuit. Basically, it does the same thing. It wants to make that shape. And he has to fight with his arms to try and move his arms back in. It constantly wants to spring him out again. So he's getting overheated, overexerted. The inside of his faceplate is beginning to fog up, and he's having a real hard time. And so he eventually decides it's time to get back in, and he finds he doesn't fit anymore. His spacesuit is inflated to the point he can't get back in that airlock. So he has a couple of choices here. He can either stay outside and die, or he can start to bleed the air out of his own spacesuit and hope that he can bring it down enough that he can actually get back in. Now, I don't know if you've ever heard about what happens to divers when they come up from the bottom of the ocean too quick. They get nitrogen bubbles in their blood. They get what's called the bends, and it can actually kill them. Same thing will happen if you start lowering the pressure in a spacesuit very quickly too much. It can actually cause a fatal condition. He had no choice, so he brings his pressure down to the point where he's told it's safe, and he still can't get back in. So then he goes below that line. He keeps reducing it more and more. Finally is able to get back in. At this point, he can't see. His heart rate is dangerous. So he basically just floats in the airlock until he's able to catch his breath, gets back in the spacecraft. He survived. The first spacewalk has happened, and nobody in the West knows about this. Nobody apart from a couple of top secret people in the program know how dangerous this has been. For the whole world knows. The Russians again have done this incredible thing, done this amazing spacewalk. So you can see again, the Russians are pushing these headlines. They're doing it in a dangerous way, but they're getting these firsts. In the meantime, America has been doing the right thing. America has been designing the first two-person spacecraft that's a very safe spacecraft. It kind of looks like a fighter jet, and you're sitting in the seat looking out of a window facing forwards, very much designed by fighter pilots. And this spacecraft is the Gemini spacecraft. It gets totally overlooked in most space histories, most popular histories, because people think about John Glenn and the Mercury stuff. They think about Apollo 11 and the Apollo stuff. But this, like in a year and a half, America basically learned how to rendezvous in space, how to spacewalk, how to dock, how to do all the things that they needed to do to get to the moon. And without learning it here, it would have been very difficult to have really gone to the moon in the way America did. And to do that, America needed to choose more astronauts. The original 7 in the front were chosen at a time when America didn't know what an astronaut was. Nobody did, because nobody had ever been an astronaut before. So they needed to choose new people. So in the back row here, you start seeing people like Frank Borman and Jim Lovell, who made the very first flight to the moon. You see a very, very young Neil Armstrong in there too, third from the right there, looking like he's about 12 years old. And just, these guys were, in many ways, they knew now what an astronaut needed to be. They wanted advanced engineering degrees as well as incredible test piloting experience. They wanted very methodical, careful people who could push it right to the edge and yet know exactly where they were and exactly what they were doing and able to tell the ground what was going on. They were a whole different breed of astronauts, basically. And eventually, 3 of this new breed became the Apollo 11 crew. And one of the things that Jim Hansen and others here will be talking about is how Neil Armstrong became this first person to land on the moon. A lot of people think it was somehow preordained, it was somehow pre-chosen to be this guy. Not at all. I mean, this ended up being about one of 4 crews who had the possibility of making the first landing attempt. And if that attempt had not worked, another crew would have tried it. But they're each very, very interesting guys. Mike Collins on the left, Buzz Aldrin in the middle, Neil Armstrong on the right, all had one flight before Apollo 11. They each had one flight in these Gemini flights. And I'll kind of take you through those and give you an idea about maybe why these 3 guys were chosen as one of those 4 crews who were going to be given that first shot at landing on the moon. So the first to fly is Neil Armstrong here on the left with Dave Scott. He's going to be flying a mission where they launch into space and try and find an unmanned rocket and make the very first docking in space. They're going to take their manned Gemini spacecraft and actually put it into the docking collar of another unmanned spacecraft that's up there. A huge deal, because if you're going to the moon and coming back, you need to know how to find another spacecraft in space and dock with it. You remember that sort of iconic image I showed you at the beginning of Neil Armstrong, sort of heroic with the American flag and the moon behind him? This is far more the Neil Armstrong that people who work with him describe. This is a guy poring over engineering diagrams, trying to get every last detail right. He described himself as a nerdy, pocket-protecting engineer. That's how he described himself, and this is what this guy was like. He was a very methodical, quiet guy who was going to be knowing everything he could about every system so that he was as prepared as he could be when he went on this pioneering mission to go make this very first docking. So they launch on a Titan rocket, they get up into space, and this is what they're looking for. They're looking for this Agena rocket. The Agena rockets had some issues. It's not the most reliable rocket, and the ground controllers are told the crew, if anything kind of goes wrong, it's probably going to be this Agena rocket that's giving them some issues. So if anything's wrong, back away from it, you'll be fine. So they get up to the docking collar, they dock, they make this very first docking that anybody's ever made in space. And then after a while, they notice something kind of weird is happening. And if you see the movie First Man, it shows you this incredibly well. And if you haven't seen it yet, as Dr. Howard mentioned, go see it as part of this event, because you really get a sense of what this was like. The spacecraft begins to turn slightly. And so something is making them turn. They're not sure what, but they've been told the Agena has problems. So they do the natural thing, which is to undock from this rocket, only to find themselves spinning faster and faster. If you look at the front of this picture, you can see the front of their spacecraft, and there are some little sort of whiter areas. You have some thrusters on the front of that. They're supposed to allow them to navigate in space. One of those has got stuck in the on position. And so if you think about, you're in weightlessness, there's no friction. If something gets stuck on, it's going to make you spin faster and faster. There's nothing to slow you down. Even if you turn it off, that's not going to slow you down. You're just going to not go any faster. So imagine sitting in your chair right now, and I rotate you at once per second, what that would feel like. So imagine these guys sitting in this spacecraft. It's rotating that quickly around them. Their helmeted heads are banging together. They're beginning to get that tunneling of vision as the oxygen begins to leave your head and you start to see less and less. They know that's bad. They know that means they could pass out. And like I mentioned, it's not like if they pass out, the spacecraft's going to slow down. They would essentially never wake up again. They would be dead. Now, most of us in that situation would panic. Most of us would have no idea what to do, and even if we did, that physical exertion would be so extreme, we'd probably never be able to collect our thoughts and do that. Well, Neil Armstrong and Dave Scott were so collected, they actually worked out how to do an emergency procedure that nobody else had ever done before. Armstrong was able to turn off the thruster that was making them spin, which only made it not go any faster. Then they were able to work out, okay, there's a backup set of thrusters that we're supposed to use to come in for re-entry. Let's turn those on. Let's work out which thruster is going to thrust in the opposite direction from the one we're going. Let's turn that one on. Very, very difficult to do in those circumstances, but they were able to do that, and gradually the spacecraft was able to slow down and get under control. At that point, the mission is over. They've turned on the system that's supposed to bring them down to Earth. So the rules were, you've got to come back. So they splashed down on the other side of the planet from where they were supposed to be, in the wrong ocean. Didn't matter, because there were some naval ships out there that were able to pick them up. But the mission, in many ways, was a failure. But people noticed what Neil Armstrong did, and I have to believe that the mission planners at that point went, this guy knows what he's doing in a very, very difficult, unknown situation. This is somebody we should keep in mind for future pioneering missions. So the next of those three to go up was Mike Collins. He's here with John Young is on the left, and Mike Collins is on the right. Mike Collins was sent back up to go back to that same Agena. It's now been sitting up in space for a while. Its batteries are dead. It's essentially a static object. But they thought, let's try a spacewalk out to it. They'd done a couple of spacewalks already. One had gone okay, one had really not gone very well. But they thought, how hard can this be? We're going to open the hatch, we'll jump out, float over to the other one, and when we're over there, we'll rip some samples off the side. There were some samples that were left there so they could see what happens to things that have been left in space for a long time. So Mike Collins opens the hatch. He's got this big umbilical cord, which is providing his power, his oxygen, and his radio capability. And should be really simple, but they really hadn't thought through the laws of physics. He jumps out, and immediately, a little bit like if you ever had a garden hose and you've left it in the sun too long and it kind of doesn't want to unfold, that's what's happening with this big umbilical cord that has no gravity acting on it. So anytime a slight motion goes into it, that motion whips down through it, goes back up again. It doesn't want to unfold. So Mike Collins comes out, it immediately sort of whips him around the bottom of the spacecraft and slams him into the underside of it. So that didn't work out so well. So he tries jumping again. Eventually, he manages to make it over to the other side. They hadn't really thought about physics. He holds onto one end of this Agena spacecraft, which immediately starts bucking back and forward. He's imparted some motion into something that's just floating into space. So now he's holding onto something that's trying to shake him off. He's seeing some big, jagged bits of metal sticking out of it, which he didn't know was going to be there, and he's very worried about his spacesuit glove getting cut and all the oxygen coming out of his glove. So it's beginning to look like a perilous situation. He manages to get the samples, manages to jump back and get inside his own spacecraft, but it's not gone anywhere near as well as the flight controllers hoped. And they're realizing they know just enough about spacewalking now to know that all their assumptions about how easy it would be, they pretty much got to throw them out the window. The Russians had had a hard time, as I explained to you, but America didn't know that at the time. That was top secret. So people are having trouble with spacewalks, and Mike Collins manages to successfully do his, though. So once again, I have to think the mission controllers went, this guy can be put in a situation where he can come through it and actually do as much as we can in an unknown situation. So the last of those three to fly was Buzz Aldrin, and Buzz Aldrin wasn't supposed to fly on Gemini. Buzz Aldrin had kind of made some mistakes, and I'm not telling you anything that Buzz Aldrin hasn't said himself. Buzz Aldrin was an incredibly bright, and still is an incredibly bright academic, fearsomely bright. And his specialty, as when he got his doctorate, was orbital rendezvous, how things find each other in space. He had basically worked out some very good ways of doing that. And like a lot of people at the top of their game, he came into NASA saying, I know how to do this. If you guys listen to me, or if you guys put me up on an early flight and I'll prove it to you, I can show you how to do something that's an incredibly difficult thing to do. The trouble was he had no sense of office politics, and this is something he's admitted later on. He really didn't know how to integrate himself with a very bright team of people, because everybody else who was already there, they'd been there for years. They were all American heroes. They were all people who thought very highly of themselves. So when you got this new guy coming in and saying, let me show you all what to do because you don't know, their understandable response was like, go sit in the back of the room and we'll call on you when we need you. So this guy got essentially shunted to one side. Eventually he got a flight assignment. He was put on a backup crew, and the way the backup crews worked is you trained as a backup person, which meant somebody had to break their leg otherwise, if you were ever going to fly. Otherwise you were doing all the work and not flying. And then you'd wait out 2 missions, and then you'd fly the next one. That would put him on track to fly Gemini 13. The trouble was the program ended at Gemini 12. So he was being given the worst possible assignment, maybe almost as kind of a rebuke. He was being told, do all the backup work, but you're not going to fly on Gemini, which meant he probably wouldn't have flown on any early Apollo missions. So, but he did it. He did what he was told, and he sat back there. And then, as often happens in very high performance, high danger professions, 2 astronauts died. 2 astronauts were flying their T-38 jets to go and look at their spacecraft. The weather got really bad. Their jet crashed, and 2 of them died, which meant that every flight crew got shuffled up one place. So having been given the worst assignment ever, all of a sudden Buzz Aldrin found himself on the very last seat on the very last mission of Gemini. And so his rendezvous stuff that he'd hoped to do had pretty much been worked out at that point, but he realized that spacewalking was still something that needed to be solved, as did a lot of other people. So his task became how to spacewalk. And this was the very last flight to Gemini. If they didn't work this out before Apollo, they were going to be going into Apollo not knowing how to do a crucial thing. So Buzz and the mission planners decided, let's not do a spacewalk to do something. Let's not go and try and go over to another object or something. Let's just do a spacewalk for the sake of doing a spacewalk and test things, just see how we move. So they started thinking about putting their feet in foot restraints. They started tethering themselves across the shoulder to hold them in place. And on the back of the spacecraft that he's going to be spacewalking from, they just put some very simple tasks. Take this tube out and put it in here. Almost like you see at kids' play areas, move a block from here to here. Doesn't do anything, but it shows that you can move things. And they started doing a lot of training underwater, which they found was a lot more helpful to learn how to spacewalk. It almost became like ballet dancers, choreographing the moves, looking how to do it. So Buzz was the guy who did that. He got into space on Gemini 12. He got outside. He went to the back of the spacecraft. He started doing this stuff. And it all went perfectly. He didn't overheat. Nothing went wrong. So not the most popular guy in the office, but nevertheless, this is the guy who was seen to be able to do something, again, something a little bit innovative, and somebody that the mission planners went, okay, he knows how to spacewalk. He solved a problem for us as part of a much bigger team. So eventually this crew were put together for those very first Apollo missions, and they were, like I mentioned, one of about 4 who were being considered for the first lunar landing mission. But first, America had to get Apollo off the ground. They wanted to test it in Earth orbit first, make sure everything worked fine before they went out to the moon. So the first crew was Apollo 1. They were going to get ready to fly in January of 1967. Just weeks away from doing that, they're training in their spacecraft, and there's a really bad fire, and all 3 of them die on the pad. So America hasn't even gone anywhere in Apollo, and they've not even got off the ground, and all of a sudden they've killed 3 astronauts. 3 astronauts have been lost. So these days, I can't even imagine an accident report being finished and the things happening in 2 years. But as you know, this is in January 1967. Americans were walking on the moon in July of 1969. So you know that things must have happened incredibly quick, and that's exactly what happened. They worked out what had caused this. It was a probably some chafed wiring in the bottom of the spacecraft, a pure oxygen environment. A little flame becomes an inferno. There were a lot of things in the spacecraft that could catch fire very easily. So they worked on the wiring, they worked on what could catch fire, they made a whole bunch of other changes to the spacecraft, made it very safe. Took about a year and a half to do that, though. So now we're going to be in 1968, and before America gets going again. So the Russians have the ideal chance at this point to get ahead of America because of a tragedy. Not the greatest reason to get ahead, but the Russians were not going to not take it. And they'd been doing the right thing. Through all these Gemini missions, they'd stopped doing these stunts. They'd finally started working on a brand new spacecraft called Soyuz. And they're still flying Soyuz today. There's one attached to the space station right now. It's like the great-great-great-grandchild of the original. They've worked on improving it a lot. But they came up with a spacecraft that could do everything they needed it to do. But they had to fly that one first as well, because if they didn't fly that and test it out, they weren't going to feel comfortable sending a different version of it around the moon within the next year. So they went back to Vladimir Komarov, that guy who had been the commander of that three-person mission, very accomplished test pilot. So they launch him into space just a couple of months after that Apollo 1 fire, hoping that they can get ahead of America. But when they get into space, they realize they're kind of having the same issues. This spacecraft has been rushed. There's a lot of things that are wrong with it. The solar panels are not deploying correctly. There's a sensor that's supposed to find where the sun is that will help orient the spacecraft, and there's something going wrong with that too. It's not working great. So they decide to bring him home. He's an incredibly accomplished test pilot. He can work out how to manually control the spacecraft and bring it down through the atmosphere, and everything's going great. But there are a couple of things he can't do, because they're automatic systems. So one is, there's a certain point through the atmosphere, the parachutes are supposed to come out, and they don't. So basically, he comes back to Earth, but he crashes into Earth at hundreds of miles an hour, and this is all that's left of his spacecraft. So if you were to write this as a movie, it would seem too impossible. Both countries have had great success. Both in the beginning of 1967, within a couple of months of each other, they both have their first major tragedy. Who's going to get off the launch pad first and get back into space and have some success is probably going to be who gets to the moon first. So it's anybody's game at this point as to who's going to get around the moon first. America does it first in October of 1968. They had some unmanned Apollo missions, and then with Apollo 7, they launched 3 people into space. The mission goes so well, the spacecraft is so well fixed, that by an 11-day mission, by the 4th or 5th day, the astronauts are scratching the day on the side of the spacecraft, a little bit like prisoners do on a prison wall, because everything's going so well. They thoroughly test-check this spacecraft. Everything works perfectly. So America is now feeling confident that it has a working spacecraft. The Russians do the same. They launch an unmanned Soyuz 2, and then they launch Beregovoy on Soyuz 3. He goes up there to rendezvous with it. Doesn't go quite as well as they hoped. He gets a little disoriented about which side of the spacecraft is which. He runs out of fuel, but he's able to rendezvous with it. And so the spacecraft works fine. He survives the flight. So it looks like the Soyuz spacecraft works well as well. The Russians have a plan for this Soyuz spacecraft. They want to fly it around the moon. And they just want to put at least one person in it. And as far as they're concerned, if they send somebody around the moon before America, most people are going to consider that they won the space race. America might be able to land on the moon first, but Russians are going to be able to put somebody around. This is a picture the Russians took from a Soyuz derivative spacecraft that went around the moon of the Earth rising above the moon. And it's taken by an automatic camera. There were some turtles and some fruit flies and other things on this flight. They were living creatures. They made it back to Earth safely. The Russians could have had somebody in this. They had some issues with re-entry, though. They were having some issues where the guidance system wasn't working and people were coming down ballistically. It would have caused great injury, but a person would have survived. But the Russians finally were being cautious. The Russians were saying, let's get this trajectory system absolutely right before we risk putting somebody on it. But they were absolutely ready by the end of 1968 to send somebody around the moon first, at which point people would have probably said the space race was a tie. Russians went around the moon first, America landed on the moon first. It was kind of equal. So America knew this through some top secret channels, and they decided to do kind of what the Russians were doing. Let's take a big leap. Let's take a big risky leap and push things forward because we want to make a propaganda statement. We want to get a first. So despite that Apollo 1 spacecraft having killed people, the Apollo's only being flown once since, on Apollo 7, they decided the very next Apollo mission, they were going to do something never been done before. Take this 363-foot tall Saturn V rocket, which nobody had ever flown on before. It only flown twice before, and it had vibrated so much, they were actually worried it was going to shake itself to pieces. They were still working on issues with this rocket. put 3 people on top of it, get them into Earth orbit, and then fire them a 3-day journey out to the moon, 250,000 miles away, where if something went wrong, there was no way of coming back. We actually slow them down into lunar orbit, so they would actually have to come out of lunar orbit with a working rocket just to get back to Earth, and then re-enter the Earth's atmosphere at speeds that nobody had ever done before. Pretty risky, but that's what they decided to do, and that's what they did. In December of 1968, America sent the first people out to the moon. At that point, the space race is pretty much over. The Russians really have no hope of catching up with that. They had some plans to land people on the moon, but they're not going to get them done within the next 6 months unless America has another tragedy, unless something else delays the American space program. They know it's pretty much over. So America has to push forward. It wants to land people on the moon in 1969. We're now in 1969. So there's a very careful checkout of the lunar module. The spacecraft that's going to land people on the moon is done with Apollo 9 around Earth orbit. Very weird-looking spacecraft. It has no reason to ever enter an atmosphere. It's only going to be landing on the moon and coming back from the moon. So you can see it can be any shape it wants to be. No wings, no aerodynamics at all, just a kind of a collection of clunky boxes, essentially. But it works. Everything works great. They go around the moon on Apollo 10. They swoop so close over the landing site, it's kind of like an airplane coming over about 8 miles over. So having gone 250,000 miles, they've done everything to get Apollo 11 ready. Then the last 8 miles, the last few minutes of landing, in fact, they're joking with the Apollo 11 crew that they've painted a big white line in the sky, and all they've got to do is follow it. All the work's been done for them. So what's going to happen is they're going to actually pass over a lot of great knowledge to that Apollo 11 crew to get them ready. So the Apollo 11 crew are given this opportunity to make that first attempt with the understanding that if something goes wrong on the way, they may not land, they'll come back, and another attempt will be made. So they launch in July of 1969 on top of that big rocket, get out around the moon, separate the 2 different spacecraft. Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin are in this one, and Mike Collins stays behind in the orbit of the moon, ready to collect them and bring them back to Earth at the end of the mission. So at this point, only a few minutes, only a few miles are left, and you'd think it'd be pretty simple. It turned out to be anything but simple to make this very first landing on the moon. They're descending towards the moon, and they're looking for things ahead of them. They have the sun behind them because they don't want the sun in their eyes. They're also going to be landing, as you can see, Apollo 11 landing site is on this map. They want to land as close to where the shadows are longest as they can with the sun behind them. Because if you can imagine looking down at a desert with the sun directly overhead, everything would be kind of washed out, where if the sun is low, you'd see big, long shadows of rocks. They've got some photos of this area, but they really don't know how rocky and this area is, and they don't want to land on top of a big rock and have themselves pitch over or fall over. They're going into an unknown area, so they've got to find a landing site. They only have a few minutes of fuel to really do that, and they can't really go too far off course. The trouble is, as they're beginning to go down, there's a computer alarm inside this spacecraft, a very, very simple spacecraft, and it's basically saying, I'm beginning to overload. I'm beginning to get too many things to do. They're also very slightly off course just because of the way they undocked. There was a little bit of air left in the tunnel, and it was enough just to push them a little bit off course. So they're looking inside the spacecraft, looking at these computers, trying to work out what's going wrong. By the time they look out, they're about 4 miles off where they thought they were going to be. The craters they thought were going to be coming past their windows that they trained for, they're not seeing them. So they're going to go into an area that they don't know. And this is a picture taken on the ground when they're down, but you can get an idea of the kind of area they were going into. They had some huge boulders. It's kind of hard to tell how big things are in this picture, but they were flying directly into a huge crater that had boulders as big as houses and as big as cars all around the outside of it. Not somewhere you want to put a spacecraft down. So Neil Armstrong's beginning to come down to the surface of the moon. Buzz Aldrin is reading off the different rates and all the information he needs to hear. And as he's coming down, he starts to see there's nowhere he's feeling good about landing. So he starts kind of flying forward across the surface like a helicopter does. It uses a lot of fuel. The people in Mission Control are watching this thinking, he's going to run out of fuel. They start saying things like 60 seconds, 30 seconds, getting pretty close. But they know that Neil Armstrong is a really good pilot. They're going to trust him to do the right thing. And they have a very good hope that he's going to find a clear area. And that's what Armstrong's doing. He's flying forward, looking for a area not much bigger than the spacecraft. That's all he needs to try and put it down. He finally sees somewhere that's about twice as big as the spacecraft, essentially, that he feels comfortable putting it down in. So he starts to descend. As he starts coming down, this is some pictures from some onboard camera footage. You can see in the bottom right one there, all of a sudden, the people in Mission Control are hearing something they've never heard before. They're saying they're kicking up some dust. And that's what's happening is the engine on the bottom is blowing dust away in all different directions. This is not what you want to see as a pilot because you're seeing dust moving away from you very quickly. And it's very hard to tell am I moving or is that moving? Because you imagine if you're looking at you're looking at something moving away from you. If you're moving backwards ever so slightly, there might be a huge boulder behind you that you're about to go land on. You don't want to do that. So if you can imagine, like, you've ever seen like a rock in the middle of a river, that the river's flowing past it, and you know that rock isn't moving. If you look in this picture, you can see there are a couple of rocks that are sticking out above that dust. Armstrong fixes his eyes on a couple of those rocks, and he goes, I know those are not moving. And he gradually brings that spacecraft down and makes that very first landing on the moon. It's kind of hard to tell from this picture because with no atmosphere on the moon, everything looks as close or as far away. But if you look through the legs there, you can see there's a pretty big crater not very far away from this landing site with some pretty big boulders on there. And then after that, the area kind of undulates a lot. So he chose one of the few safe flat areas in a very weird kind of place that was not the safest place to land, but he found that safe place. Now, if you talk to Neil Armstrong after the flight, and people for the rest of his life would ask him, what was it like to walk on the moon? He didn't think that was that big a deal. This was the big deal, and I hope I've tried to show you how this was a big deal, because if you could imagine being a pilot and you're trying to find an aircraft carrier in the middle of the night, and it's a bad storm, and you're trying to land it in the middle of the ocean, and you find it and you land it, you'd feel great about that. You'd feel like you accomplished something incredible. And once you turn the engine off and you walk down the ladder to get out the aircraft, you'd be like, well, that's no big deal. That's easy. And that's kind of how Armstrong would relate what this flight. He thought the actual walking down the ladder on the moon was no big deal. The landing on the moon was the huge thing. But nevertheless, for the people back on Earth, looking at this moment on the TV screen, this was the moment that really captured everybody's imagination, because it wasn't to do with piloting, it was to do with setting that very first footprint on another world. And that was the incredible moment for everything back home, and that's what we're going to be talking about in the panel right after this. So when I was doing these books, I had a really great opportunity to talk to Armstrong and Aldrin and all these other people, and it's always interesting when you talk to somebody about something that they've been asked every day of their life. If you can imagine, you went on a vacation somewhere great 40 years ago, and then everybody asks you every day, what was that like? After a while, you'd stop thinking about that original memory, and you'd just be saying, well, there was some nice palm trees, and I had some nice drinks, and the hotel was great, and you'd tell the same story over and over again. The fun thing with working with these guys is to come up with original questions, things which you could see their eyes kind of going, I haven't thought about that, and nobody's ever asked me that. And you'd see their minds going back to where they were originally at that moment, and that was a wonderful feeling to know that they were thinking about what it was like when they very first landed on the moon. So that's the end of my talk. If anybody had any questions, I'd be happy to answer those, and thank you very much. Do we have any questions, or should we move on to our next thing? Okay, well, thank you, and I think we're going to get set up for the next panel then. Thank you.
Yes. So, hi. Now first of all, thank you, Mr. French, for this presentation about the history of the space travel and the space race. I want to thank Dr. May and all the administration, including both the Common Mass Media Department with the Physics and Geosciences Department. Also want to thank, once again, our Suddenlink, our official sponsor. Now like Mr. French said, we're going to have our panel discussion with all of our guests here. So if you would like to welcome every single guest here now.
Got an extra, I guess. We might want to have a place for her. I don't know. She gonna stand up there?
We have.
Such a good speech. We should have two of you here.
Oh, I'm glad you enjoyed it. I'm looking forward to you telling me everything I got wrong.
I'll wait till we get the mics on.
There you go. Okay.
What a nice guy.
I like him, I really do.
That's great stuff. Do you think think we should move down one for her to sit down some, or not?
I don't know.
I don't know why they put an extra seat here.
We've only got 2 mics, so this might actually work out.
It's for my ego.
Oh, it's for your ego, okay.
Ah,
It's deserved.
Yeah.
Oh,
so
no.
we need the big Neil standee here.
Yeah, we could get a cardboard cutout.
I think I told you that, the very first time I ever met you was at the lobby of the Air and Space Museum and you were in that book signing when the book first came out. And then just the other week, there's a huge cardboard standee thing.
Yes.
A big one.
movie?
And I'm thinking, what a great,
Sure.
full circle kind of thing. The very first place I met Jim. Now there's this massive,
Yeah.
promotion
That was a
for,
cool
And it's got
event
a,
because it had and I brought all the Navy guys in.
Yeah.
I've got it
You know,
here,
and
so I
it
could
was
show
too
it
bad
to
Neil
you.
wouldn't come himself. He just felt like
Yeah,
We
and
didn't really
you
want
can
to
move
be
to
a
the next
part of any
slide,
of
the
it,
next
and
slide,
it's
and
had
it's
to go
got
with the book for
a
Yeah.
laser pointer.
But
it's fun, we got to
idea-
hear all these Neil stories from the people who flew then.
Yeah, well, that was probably, in that sense, it was good maybe that he wasn't there because
Yeah.
he felt a little freer to talk
Right.
about it than they might have otherwise. But,
Noting in detail, the last photo there, and Armstrong. Aldrin is showing you the one she saw last night.
Of course, yep. He's always got his bling, that's for sure.
Pardon?
He's always got his bling on somewhere behind.
I think the movie shows him wearing his Masonic ring.
Yeah, they did it a little bit, I can't remember.
I don't know if he normally wore that or
I
not.
don't know. We'll look for it again.
Yeah. Well, a lot of what you said will help them understand the movie better.
I hope so. I really should replace that picture of the crater with one of something from
Ah,
60 mil or something, but you
well,
kind of get the idea. But
No, actually, I thought that one, because some people have said, the crater that's shown in the film is too severe. It's too,
well, yeah.
which
And
it
the
is a
one he
little
flew,
bit.
one they fly over and the one he
Yeah,
throws things in
but
orbit
that,
too.
that's pretty impressive looking crater
It
that
is.
you show.
Photoshop a bracelet in it or something. Just I think I told you after I first read your book, long before any of this, when it first came out, I found myself up in Lancaster, Palmdale, and actually went and found the grave and just cleared it off a little bit. I just
Good.
thought your book kind of made me go, I
Yeah.
want to go.
Yeah, because it's not kept up. It's not
No.
kept up very
It's
well.
right by the side of the street, and I remember this kind of like right by the street within the cemetery. And it
For
just
the,
wasn't good.
I'm working with National Geographic on a documentary on Neil for next summer.
Oh, okay.
And they wanted to shoot the grave.
Yeah.
And the cemetery management required someone from the family to give them permission. So we got permission from Rick. And
Okay.
Rick wasn't sure he was the one that should give it, but
Oh, who would be?
yeah. So they wanted to show
That's
that.
good.
And did you try to go up and find the cabin? That's a little
No.
little trickier.
But I did see some program where it was like a house. It was a
Yeah,
housing show.
yeah.
And they went up and the person was selling it and they had no idea what it was. And apparently there's been some other crew back there. I think it was
Yeah.
maybe Robert was talking about it.
Yeah,
They built
that was what it was funny because they were the movie guys were driving around to try to find it, and they couldn't find it, and they didn't know which one. I mean, can you get the whole There was somebody out walking. Yeah, someone out walking. Turned out to be
Good morning, everyone. My name is Jennifer Stolseda, and I'm here representing the Communication and Mass Media Department here at Angelo State University. Today, as we continue and celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Apollo program, we'd like to present a panel discussion with our esteemed guests. During this panel, we will have a set of rules. So the first question that I'll be asking will be a 1 to 2 minute response, and the next couple questions will be a 2 to 3 minute response. And then at the end of the discussion, I'd like to open up the floor for questions, and you can ask questions that you would like to ask them. So today we'd like to welcome Mr. Joe Vano, who is the CBS News Director for the Apollo broadcast, Francis French, a space historian and a full-time writer, Dr. James Hansen, who is the author of First Man and biographer of the Apollo 11 astronaut Neil Armstrong, James O'Brien, the CBS News Associate Producer, and Bill Harwood, who is the CBS News Space Analyst. Before we begin, I'd like to thank Suddenlink, who is our official sponsor. So please welcome our panel of guests. So as we begin this panel, can you talk more about your works and your contribution to the Apollo program, starting with Mr. French?
My contributions to the Apollo program, well, I wasn't born, but what I've tried to do is I've been very fortunate to meet each of the 12 people who walked on the moon and work with a bunch of the people who went around the moon, and to try and capture what it was they did in their own words. You know, it's human nature to, when you're in the middle of doing something, you don't think about what it means, you just do it. And decades later, you actually get to think about what it means. And I've been very fortunate to work with these people 30, 40, 50 years after these facts, as it's begun to crystallize what it means to them, and get that down. Because I don't know about you, but I feel like sometimes if something isn't recorded, if something isn't documented, it's almost like it didn't happen. It's one thing to actually do it, but it's another thing to actually get it so that people understand what it truly means from that person's point of view. So I've been very fortunate to be the humble with on a bunch of books with people who actually did this incredible stuff.
Dr. James Hansen?
Good morning, everyone. I've been working as an aerospace historian now for 37 years, I think it is. I have a PhD from Ohio State in the history of science. My first job was with NASA. NASA hired me to write a book about one of its research laboratories, and one thing just kept leading to another. And by the late 1990s, I was hired to teach history at Auburn University in Alabama, and I taught courses on both undergraduate and graduate on the history of flight, both aeronautics and space. And by the late 1990s, after about 20 years in the field, I decided I wanted to do an astronaut biography, and the one that interested me the most was Armstrong, because I knew Neil was a very private man. Unlike a lot of other astronauts, he had not done his own memoirs. No author had written his book that had any kind of access to him. And so I thought, let's give that a shot. And so I wrote him, and it took 2 years. I mean, as quick as he was in the cockpit in terms of making decisions, as Francis told you about what happened in Gemini 8, he was unbelievably deliberate and slow in making decisions about almost everything else in his life. But somehow, some way, I persuaded him over the course of a couple of years that it might be a good idea to let's give this a go. So I did the book that resulted in First Man. I had 55 hours of tape-recorded interview with him. And he had never given anyone that sort of access. And then, of course, I interviewed about 130 other people. Francis does lots of interviews. That's one of the real fun things about doing the histories we've done. Folks were still living, and we were able to talk to a lot of people and get their personal stories. So it's been a real honor to be living at a time when these folks were to themselves still living, and could recollect, and we could ask them questions and sit with them for hours upon hours. So, and I'm happy to be sitting with you today.
Well, I'm Jim O'Brien, and Apollo was going on. I started there as an Air Force officer in public affairs, feeding people information or propaganda, but it wasn't, as we called it, propaganda. We did not do that, but that was a term that was used. Anyway, the going to the Cape as a young officer, we learned how to work with the media. In the Gemini program, there were 4,000 media covering every launch, and the launches were 60 days apart. And so that was my exposure to it, and to be able to be there and see that was, for me, a personal event. In Apollo, a much bigger program, I'd left the Air Force and gone to CBS and met Joel here, and that we learned that how doing network television is very different from the inside than it was from the outside. And so when you're covering something like that, you have a activity that takes place that doesn't take place now. Then moving equipment to the Cape was not left there. It was taken back to New York. Color television camera at that time was about the size of this table. I can shoot a better picture with this. It wasn't there then. So those things are the things that are in my little memory banks, and I'm glad to take this opportunity to get some of them out before maybe they disappear. And that's going to happen for all of you. It will be something that we all have in common. The other thing about covering a launch is that you do have a huge operation there of many, many people. Today, Bill will be able to tell you that the group is much smaller. And that probably is significant because with a large group of people, you've got to move them around, get them into the right place. And of course, the Cape at that time and today still is a classified area. You can't just drive out at will and drive to different places at will. So that is in thumbnail sketch of my history. You're welcome to ask any questions at the time. Here's Joel.
I started at CBS News in 1960, working with Walter Cronkite. After working for a year or so with a previous anchor for the news, Walter took over. Douglas Edwards, before Walter, was doing a 15-minute newscast at night. When Walter came on, they decided to make it a half-hour news show, and everybody in New York in the paper said, "This is crazy. Nobody wants to sit and watch news 30 minutes." But they learned quickly that it's worth having a much longer news show. And then within a year or so, the Mercury program started. And I started working on the Mercury shots as an assistant director, an associate director, as we say in television. In motion pictures, it's an assistant director, but it's an AD in either way. And I became involved right away with thinking what we needed to do to put on the screen to keep our audiences informed and letting them know what is happening. Because once that rocket goes up and at a camera range, it becomes just an audio story. You just have the voices. So from the very beginning, we had to think about what kind of images we need to create to follow that particular mission. And you'll learn more about that tonight and see that. But as with NASA and with broadcast media, sort of parallel together, going from Mercury to Gemini to Apollo, and what NASA had to do to develop the technologies, to develop the spacecraft, we in broadcasting had to, in a similar way, develop the production techniques that we had to do. And I eventually became a director, directing the last 4 Gemini missions and then all of the Apollo missions. And so there was this dichotomy of both of us, NASA, broadcasting, and taking new technologies that were developing. For Mercury, we had no computers. We didn't have videotape yet. And so it was very, very simplistic. And you'll see what I had to do to create a simulation of what was happening. And so that whole period of all these years of putting this all together and getting prepared for that first landing on the moon was worth all the time and effort, and you'll learn more about that later.
I can't even imagine what these guys did back during Apollo because it's so different today. But you know, looking at it, all of you in the audience reminds me of how I got my start. I was at the University of Tennessee in journalism, and I remember waking up and watching the first shuttle take off back in 1981. And that fired me up so much, I got our student coordinator, our version of Dr. Howard, to get us credentials to cover the second shuttle launch. And so me and a photographer piled into a Volkswagen Beetle with all of his camera gear and sleeping bags because we had no money, and drove all the way down to Cape Canaveral, you know, Kennedy Space Center. Really excited, you know, see the shuttle on the launch pad. The next day, the countdown got down to 5 minutes to launch, and they scrubbed. There was contamination in some hydraulic fluid, and they said, well, we'll come back in 7 days and try again. Wonderful. So back to Knoxville, but we did come back down a week later, and I saw the shuttle take off. I'll never forget it as long as I live. I've covered 130 shuttle missions since then, but nothing equaled the first one. We're 3 miles from the pad, And when the sound finally gets to you, along with the shock wave in the ground from these solid rocket boosters, your clothes literally are vibrating on your chest. I mean, and the sound is so great, you cannot hear yourself scream. I mean, seriously. TV does not capture this. In future flights, when I had an office with UPI and eventually CBS, we'd put books at an angle so they wouldn't shake off the shelves, and we're 3 miles away. And I remember thinking the reason I was so enamored of this thing, it's a machine with people on it. It weighs 4.5 million pounds when it takes off. Almost all of that's fuel. And it goes from 0 to 100 miles an hour straight up. Think about this now. 4.5 million pounds, 0 to 100 miles an hour straight up in under 10 seconds. It doesn't look like that on television. But when you hear it and you feel it, you realize there is so much energy involved. It is inherently dangerous. People are risking their lives with it. And it is when you've seen this happen once in person, it's really hard to walk away and say, well, that's enough for me. You want to see it again and again and again. So anyway, I did a couple of launches for my school newspaper. I got hired by United Press International out of college, and I paid my way down to the Cape just to see how UPI did it, you know, kind of as a fifth wheel. And it was about that time both wire services, AP and UPI, were deciding to reopen full-time bureaus at the Cape. They had those during Apollo. They shut them down in the wake of that, but now they were reopening them, and I was just, you know, one of those things, being in the right place at the right time. And so in 1984, they made me Cape Canaveral Bureau Chief, and I've been there ever since. So like I said, I'd covered 130 shuttle missions. So my expertise is not Apollo so much as it is what came next. The space shuttle, the International Space Station, and what's getting ready to happen with Elon Musk and SpaceX building commercial cruise ships. Boeing is building commercial cruise ships. And if all goes well next year, we'll have launches off American soil on American rockets carrying astronauts back to the space station for the first time since the shuttle retired back in 2011. So that's a big deal. And while that's all going on, I'm also covering the Space Launch System NASA is developing to carry astronauts beyond low Earth orbit, eventually back to the moon, lunar orbit, and, you know, somewhat nebulously onto Mars someday. Don't know when that'll be, but all of these things are in work right now, and it's a very exciting beat to cover. And I'm glad to be here, and I'll tell you anything you might want to know about it. Thanks.
Thank you. We're glad to have you guys here, and we're going to start our first question. So to Francis French and Dr. James Hansen, how did you feel about learning about the space flights and astronauts, and what made you interested in this topic?
I've always been interested in this stuff, and I think it's because, you know, we live in a time where, you know, people have been around for thousands of years doing incredible stuff, but this is the only time in history you're going to get the firsts of people that did something off this planet, whether that's going into space, whether that's leaving Earth orbit and going out to the moon. There's never going to be a time like this. There's never going to be a time before or since in human history where you get to meet those specific firsts. You can look into the eyes of somebody who'll tell you, I lived for 3 days on the moon. I ate, slept, everything there, and this is what it was like to drive around in a lunar rover on a surface where there was bright sunshine but black sky, almost no color on the ground, 1/6 gravity, things which are incredible to think about, to actually just imagine what that was like. I think I really enjoyed getting to know these people and getting to know what that was like, and most of them are incredibly eloquent and also incredibly busy and don't really have the time to write some of that stuff down. So just to be able to listen to some of that and then be able to capture it has just been such an honor.
It's really, for me, it's all been about just the interest in history. And of course, when you're talking about events of the early space program, it's the 1960s, and I was alive then. I'm old enough to, I was a boy, I was a teenager, and so I remember when these guys were doing the Shepard launch, you know, that Francis talked about. I was a second grader that was taken down by our class to the gymnasium, and we all took our shoes off and we got on the gym floor and we watched this boxy TV, and we watched all 15 minutes of Shepard's suborbital flight and then went back to class. and so on and so on. I mean, I remember the events very clearly, as you will remember events from your youth. So I just found myself in a position where I had become, you know, a trained historian holding a doctorate, and it was really more, it was kind of like Neil being in the right place at the right time to be the commander of the landing mission. Not that there's, you know, that solid of a comparison, but really for me, a lot of things were just that circumstances put me in a certain position to take advantage of opportunities. And like I said, when I got that first sort of postdoctoral fellowship to do a book for NASA, and that opened up some doors. I started doing a lot of oral history, interviewing people that had, you know, had been working back into the Second World War and before, that had been aeronautical engineers that then moved on to the space program in later years. It was just as a historian, the topics were all fascinating, and I really got into the fact that I could do oral history, that I could talk to people. I've sometimes said to audiences that if there's a heaven for me, it would be I would get to interview everybody that's ever lived. It sounds silly, but you know, eternity is a long, long time, and maybe I can get to everybody. But I really enjoy hearing other people's life stories, and then trying to find sense in them and meaning, their meaning, and bigger meanings, and sharing that with people. So I always look for books where I can do a combination of serious archival research, and believe me, the Apollo program created millions and millions and millions of, some of the best proof that we really went to the moon is just go into the archives and look at all the documents that were produced. So of course I had to do all of that, but I really look for book projects where I can do lots of interviewing, oral history, to really sit down with the historical actors and hear their stories. And again, as Francis said, the thrill of asking them questions that maybe they've not been asked before. You know, that's really nice when you get someone to say, no one's ever asked me that. So it was just the thrill of historical studies and research for me, and being able to meet people and learn their life stories.
This next question is for Mr. Harwood, Mr. O'Brien, and Mr. Bano. So how momentous was it working on the Apollo program, and did you think that you'd be celebrating it 50 years later?
It's after you. Joel's the senior, so. And we're not talking about how old we are. Well, maybe we are.
Well, as a teenager, I always loved science fiction. And I would read a lot of science fiction books. And suddenly, I'm at CBS, and the announcements of the Mercury program and the Right Stuff guys, which I'll talk more about tonight. And we've got to start covering something we've never covered in television, and that is the launch of a manned rocket on top of a rocket. And so that was the most fascinating part of that aspect, is how do we cover space? What do we do? How many people we need? And so I just fell into the role as an assistant director of taking that work off the director's shoulders. He said, that's fine. You know, he's busy putting this program on the air. And what we needed to do, as I said earlier, to create what you see on the screen. So that was the best part of that. And through the years, when we finally got into the shuttle program, I was always hoping that maybe I could go into space someday as someone from the media, because I would have jumped at that. I really loved the whole idea of space and the universe and learning about it, and it was the greatest part of my life in the media in terms of what I was directing. And it's like, you know, you start a painting and you work a little bit and you stop and you come back, you change, and so forth. And that was kind of like what was happening in television and technology. When computers began to be used, it made a program better, it made research better, it made technology in terms of production effects better. And so it was this, again, dynamic of technology changing and television changing. And I'll never forget that whole period, but especially that day landing on the moon.
Well, it is, you have an opportunity here to listen to two really old people tell you about the way it was. And you can think about yourselves and think about where you are in life and what have you got to do and where will you look. And each of you are going to have your own answer. When I was left college and a degree in mass communication and was sent and had a commission in the Air Force as an officer. My first place was Cocoa Beach, Florida, and Cape Kennedy, which was purely by chance because remember at that time, which saying remember to you is silly for me, but we had 500,000 people going to Southeast Asia and Canada. So the point being here, what on earth made someone decide to send me to Florida to be a range photo officer and eventually in the public affairs? So it was that kind of thing that there's the fate part. But then after that, you have to be able to perform and do whatever job you have. And so that's what's interesting to me about how that has gone on. And so being in the Air Force as an officer and being there during Gemini, or Gemini, we have a dispute about that somewhere. But that was 2 men in space. And the issue there was we had, as I said before, 4,000 news media every 60 days for a couple of years. So you get to know people, and this is a lesson for you in terms of, in fact, Dr. Herman said it, that networking is really important because it's often who you know. Of course, after someone that knows you selects you, then it's what you know that will keep you there. So that was interesting. So I arrived at CBS News in New York at age 26 as an associate producer. If you know anything about network television, it's kind of rare for you to knock on the door at 524 West 57th Street and say, I'd like to go to work as an associate producer. I'm 26 years old. And the laughter will resonate with you for years. And the reason why did I end up there? Because I had an offer from NBC, from ABC, and from the AP. The reason was chock full of names, places, and events for all of Apollo, and none of these. You had the reporter's notebook. So that kind of thing is in terms of guidance and where you're going to go and what you're going to do. That was a real world experience, and so when you're trying to get somewhere in life, and you all will. It will be someone that you know that is probably going to give you a first position or a first opportunity. And then it'll be what you know. So both are really, really important. Leaving CBS, as I did, I went to the White House. I was appointed to the White House by President Nixon. Wheels of government turn slowly, so the day I reported, it was the day he resigned. They said, what? And this is an example will be revealed soon. So I stayed on in my position and was working for President Ford. President Ford selected a friend of mine to be his communications director. And his communications director had been working at CBS as a friend of, and I met him, Bob, there. And so that solidified my position in the Ford administration. And it didn't last as long as I thought. But it's another example for you about who you know to obtain a position, and then after that's followed by what you know. So I thank you for listening, and that's personal history that may reflect upon your own thoughts. And if they do and help, I'm glad to have given them. Yes, indeed.
I obviously didn't cover Apollo, but I've always thought about your question. What would somebody think 50 or 100 years down the road? And I'm struck by the fact that on the 50th anniversary of this, that virtually everybody in this room has never, your entire life, someone has already been to the moon. You have to be over 50 now to have lived at all when people hadn't gone to the moon, which I find remarkable. Arthur C. Clarke, and I may be remembering this wrong, Dr. Hansen may know the quote better than me, but he wrote somewhere that 500 years from now, the 20th century gets a paragraph or two in a high school textbook, but the Apollo 11 landing will be there. I think it's that seminal of an event. Is Ed Stone, who was the project manager for the Voyager program, project scientist, I should say, I'll never forget covering Voyager's flyby of Neptune back in 1989. He said, you can only visit a new world for the first time once. And with Apollo 11, that was the first of the new worlds that anyone has ever gone to, and that'll never change. And I think that flight will always be remembered when anybody looks back on this epoch. So anyway, that's just my sense of the significance of that mission 50 years later.
Yeah. I'd just like to bounce off what Jim was just talking about. With me, in terms of my career, which would never have happened, but something happened in my life as a teenager in high school that changed the rest of my life. When you say it's who you know, who you meet, how you go out and want to do what you want to do. I met someone in high school at CBS, and it was an English class I had, and you had to go as a project interview a CEO, a president of a company. So I decided to go after Bill Paley, the creator of CBS Broadcasting, and they set up an interview for me. Unfortunately, he had to go out of town, and so they gave me another individual, Frank Stanton, the president of CBS News. It was a wonderful.
Just throw out, that's not an easy interview to get, folks. Pretty good for a student.
And so I had the interview. It was very nice, 20 minutes with him. But, and this is what you have to think about being aggressive. I asked Dr. Stanton, would it be possible for me to see a television show, a rehearsal, and watch it be put on the air? Television at that point, drama shows, situation comedy, were live. We didn't have tape. So these were all being done live. Could I watch? Sure, I'll set you up with someone. You contact him and he'll arrange for you to come down to the studio. So he did. I made contact. I came down and watched one of the shows. And then I called that gentleman again and said, is there a chance I can see another show? And I did that about 3 or 4 times until I finally asked to see the Ed Sullivan Show. And I came down on a Sunday, and I watched the rehearsal and so forth. And I asked the gentleman working on that show, can I come back next Sunday? Well, I came back for most of my senior year, meeting people on the crew, getting to know people. And then I graduated, started college, was going to be drafted, so I enlisted into the military. But I kept in contact with that gentleman. And when I got out of the military, I got in touch with him. And after a stint at a local station, I came back to New York, and he helped get me a job at CBS in the film library. But I was at CBS, and I could see the bulletin boards. And then there was an opening for that news show as a production assistant. I got it. The guy that hired me was named Don Hewitt, and he was the guy that created 60 Minutes. And that started my career at CBS, but it was what had happened in high school with that assignment. So you never know what's going to happen, who you're going to meet. But if you know what you want to do, follow, your goals. Stick with it, and you'll make it. So I just wanted to tell you that story.
Thank you. The last question, this is for everyone. Where were you during the moon landing, and how did it make you feel when you saw Americans landing on the moon, starting with Mr. Francis?
Yeah.
Where was I during the moon landing? I wasn't even an idea for my parents, I don't think. I was born in, about 6 months afterwards, I was conceived, so yeah, I'm almost there. But my parents do tell me this story of going out that night in England and looking up at the moon and going, there are people up there right now. And just as you were saying about, there's a time before people being in the moon and not being at the moon, that was revolutionary to them, the idea that you could actually go outside and look at this thing that's always been there, that's always been this sort of romantic, mystical, mythical thing, often not so much a thing as more of an idea, and actually go, there are two people up there right now probably having breakfast. That's was amazing to them. So that's the closest I can get is listening to my parents. And that's why we're so fortunate to have people here today on this panel who are actually not only there, but also heavily involved in being there. And I can't wait to hear more of their stories over the next couple of days.
Yeah, I was between my junior and senior years of high school, and so that's the summer where you take your college, your college entrance exam. So I was busy with SAT, ACT testing and things. It was a Sunday, July 20th, 1969 was a Sunday, and the landing takes place, I was in Indiana, so I was in the central time zone, but the landing takes place in the afternoon on that Sunday, and the moonwalk is in the evening. I'm in front of the TV the whole time. There wasn't VCR, certainly wasn't DVR. The only way you could get any record of what was on the TV set was we had a Polaroid camera where the Instamatic, where the developed picture comes out of the thing, and I was taking pictures of the television screen. And so I had probably 24 of those that I still have in a shoebox back home. Which are kind of cherished items at this point. I think lots of people did that. But I want to add one other thing that I think contextualizes this. I mean, the memories of that day are clear, but back in that era, growing up as a boy, girls growing up too, the night sky was really a significant thing for us. For one thing, we spent more time, I think, we didn't have video games, so we stayed out as late as we could at night. I lived in a residential development, and there were lots of kids around, and we stayed out until our parents made us come in. We were often out at night. The night sky had become something significant and in some ways a little ominous during that era. In particular, I can barely remember the weekend that the Russian Sputnik went up, which was in '57. I was 5 years old. And I remember our parents, I knew that my parents we were visiting cousins that weekend, and I knew my parents were concerned about something that was being reported on the television. I was sensitive enough at age 5 to know that. And I remember them going out into the yard looking up, trying to see Sputnik, which you could see. You could see, even with the naked eye, you could see it. And then we had something, the Americans put up this inflatable satellite called Echo. You guys all, I'm sure, remember the Echo. They called it the Echo balloon. And you could see it moving slowly across the night sky. And I remember being at a night baseball game where everybody in the bleachers were looking up, watching Echo. Of course, I'm still quite young, and of course, this is the nuclear age. There's fears of nuclear war. The Cuban Missile Crisis is going to come around in '62. So the night sky was something that we were constantly looking at, and there was a lot of UFO reports in the 50s and 60s, much more so then than now. And so we were just really alert to what was going on up there. And so the whole space program and the space shots and the competition between the Russians and the U.S. in the Cold War setting, there was always like a threatening element to it. And the night sky was this mysterious thing that we were drawn to. And so I just wanted to explain that, because that's a cultural thing that I think anybody that grew up in that era was aware of and felt. And so the moon landing just sort of fits into, it isn't like we were paying no attention to the night sky, no attention to space, and all of a sudden there's a moon landing and we pay attention to it. There had been a tremendous buildup of expectations and anticipation and imagination that was, and fear, really fear, that was related to this.
On the day of the landing on the lunar surface, I was trying to keep awake. Really tired. Why? Because I'd been awake since the launch days before. And you had to stay awake to do your job. You know, we hadn't invented anything yet, and probably haven't yet. Maybe one of you will, that will do your job for you and you can take a nap. But that was an issue for everybody in broadcasting. You got to imagine what happened for Joel to have to be. I was at one site, and that was the site where we made the command module, which was what Collins stayed in, orbiting the lunar moon, and that was in Compton, California. So at the launch day, then we left the Cape, go to Los Angeles, go to Compton, but Joel's got 10 different sites all at once to keep track of and put it on. So staying awake is really critical in that position. My position in California was wonderful for me because we had a whole crew out there. And that was Jack Kelly, and it was another producer, and so he had to really, really stay awake. But you couldn't stay awake that long because you've now been awake 30 hours, and most people are not going to stay awake. So I did give myself a little bit of an edge and say, okay, you just went to sleep a little while here. But fortunately, I wasn't driving a train or flying an airplane, so we did it and got through it, and it was a time I'll never forget.
It's funny you bring that up, because I was just thinking, we were on the air continuously on the day of the landing for about 34, 35 hours, and I was directing for that amount of time. But overnight, we were putting on the air pre-prepared films and stories. And so I was able to take a couple of hours break, but that's about it.
He could take a couple of hours break, but the mission was still going on, and things were happening on the moon. And so you couldn't really go to sleep, neither of us. You could doze off, but you couldn't, it's not like really sleep.
Right. But this was before the landing.
Yes.
So, but as far as the landing itself, loving space so much, my focus, I couldn't really get excited because, as you'll learn more tonight, I was flying that mission. I was concentrating on put everything on the air at the same time, the astronauts and what they were doing. And when it landed again on the moon, I finally had a chance, you know, when everybody was, mission control was going crazy and so forth. I still had to keep putting these pictures on the air from different sources around the world, cutting here, cutting there. I didn't really have a chance to feel the euphoria of, you know, what had just happened until I think we went to our first commercial break. And I could kind of sit back and realize that we all did this, not just them, but the wonderful crews and producers and technicians that we had. So then I really began to feel, you know, the wonder of it.
I'm the same age as Jim down here, and I was in high school that summer day between junior and senior year. And what I remember is the very euphoria he's talking about. Because even in high school, this was an event like, I was really trying to think what other event rivals this in terms of the way it gripped everyone. I mean, if you were there, if you were alive that day, you were paying attention to this one thing because it was, you just couldn't believe it. And I remember watching that landing on television or listening to it because there was no video of landing. And I couldn't believe they were going to pull it off. You know, and it was, when he landed, you know, Tranquility Base here, the Eagles landed and all that, it was like this overwhelming sense of relief. They were alive. And kind of the same idea, you go out and look at the moon and realize there's two people up there. That had never happened before in the history of the solar system. You know, and it was just I just had this overwhelming sense of witnessing history in a way that I can't think of anything that really rivals it. I mean, obviously JFK assassination, which I remember. I remember looking at Sputnik, by the way, because we went out in the front yard in Nashville. I couldn't see it, but we made the effort. But there are events that come along in your life that are huge events like that, War and Peace, but I just can't think of anything that rivaled that day to think that for the first time, human beings have landed on the moon. And I was overwhelmed by it. And unlike you, I didn't have a job that required every conscious moment. And I absolutely felt the euphoria and have never forgotten it.
Well, one thing maybe just to add quickly is that this was happening all over the world. I mean, this was an international, and what was interesting, the astronauts themselves, the Apollo 11 crew, they took an around the world tour, celebratory tour to all these different countries after they came back. And they had, I mean, tens of thousands of people showed up at every city they stopped at. And people were saying, we did this. It wasn't, I mean, everybody knew it was the Americans that had done it, but everybody felt like they were a part of it. And of course, there was a plaque on the leg of the lunar module said, we come in peace for all mankind. And Neil said, it's one giant leap for mankind. So there was this feeling that it was, everybody was in on this. And there were big crowds outside of, you know, in Tokyo and in Warsaw, Poland, where they were watching the TV feed on big screens. So it was a global sharing that's unlike anything I think that we've ever had as well. It wasn't just an American event.
And that's what amazed me also, because knowing where we were going to be going to, the various cities around the world, at one point when it was kind of over that day, we could all breathe again, realizing that what we had just put out on the air was for the entire planet called Earth, and not just, you know, in the United States. And that's what really hit me, the enormity of what media did, what CBS did at that time, all the networks.
I'd just like to add that the plaque, this is the politics in me, the plaque on the lunar module was signed by President Nixon, who I later worked for, even though he left the day I arrived. Not because of my arrival.
So now we're going to open up the floor for questions. So if you have a question, please state your name and who you're addressing. You can come up right here and ask some questions.
Hi, my name is Sydney. This is kind of a question for anyone, but mostly Mr. Dana, because that's interested in media and stuff and what comes with that. So basically, I was wondering, like, how do you reply to people that say like the moon landing stage or like a conspiracy or like stuff like that?
Okay. Well, my reply is very easy. I've had two incidents in my life. One, just this past week, someone was assisting me between the terminals, and he wanted to know why I was coming to Dallas, where I was going, and I mentioned the event. And so he says to me, did they really land on the moon? I mean, he still had in his head, but maybe they didn't. So I said to him, I can guarantee you that they landed on the moon because I covered that on television, and what you saw was the real thing. And then a year ago in a doctor's office where I was there and I had to wait for something, and asked me, I don't know how it came up, but I talked about that I was involved with the space program. He says, oh, wait a minute. You've got to go meet Dr. So-and-so because he believes it was a fake, that it never happened. So he was eating his sandwich in his office. It was lunchtime or something. And so I said, go over and talk to him and tell him what you've done. So I sat there, and step by step, I convinced him that finally this wasn't a farce. It really happened because of what I did and what I know. So, yeah, it's, people still do. When you go on YouTube, where I researched a lot of the material for my talk, you see these videos that have been edited and put together by people saying that that's not really on. I see that thing in the background, that's not real. So they did this in a studio or something to that effect. And that still happens, when you go online and look at that stuff.
I think the ultimate answer I found to that one is
The lady from CNN?
is that, the only way this conspiracy works is, the Soviet Union was America's mortal enemy. They had radar, they had tracking, they had the ability to know where America was in space the whole time, and they would have loved to have busted America. So the only way this conspiracy works is if the Soviet Union, America's hated enemy, is in on the conspiracy. So if you believe that, then, I can't help you, because that's when it goes into a whole other realm.
Okay, also, another question, why haven't we been back to the moon, since then?
I think I could take that one too, because it is political. Congress doesn't want to spend the money. And it's as simple as that. Also, you might want to consider the fact, how did Apollo, not just 11, but how did Apollo exist so well for so long when we were spending a huge amount of money bombing people in Vietnam and other issues in America? Well, Apollo, the people that contracted for pieces and parts of Apollo, had contracts with companies in every state of the Union. Now, what's important about that? Because there's a congressman representing every state of the Union, and it's the Congress that presents and provides the budget. So that's something that's probably not in the thought channel of most people, but that's actually real. Sir.
I was just going to say, as a historian, I'm a big believer in chaos theory, that things happen, that are not to be expected and not preordained, and for the Apollo program to come together and for the moon landing to happen, an unbelievable and extraordinary combination of circumstances, political, economic, social, cultural, had to come together. And so the question, it's certainly a good question, why haven't we come back? But, as a historian, and you can answer that historically, but it's really it's a challenge to explain, well, how in the heck did we finally really do it in the first place? It wasn't what was planned. If you look at what space pioneers, the space visionaries when they were looking ahead, say from the vantage of the early 1950s, when Arthur Clarke or Werner von Braun or others were looking at how this would happen, they were thinking that we'd essentially we would find a way to build a shuttle-like vehicle, and we would learn how to do Earth orbiting capabilities. We would build a space station in Earth orbit, and then we would do a lunar mission from the Earth orbit platform, and then we would do it in a step-by-step incremental thing. If you ever watch the movie 2001: A Space Odyssey, it opens up with a shuttle arriving at a space station, revolving wheel space station in Earth orbit. It gets to Earth orbit, then it gets into another vehicle that goes to the moon. So the expectation of how we were going to do space exploration was very different than the way we really did it, and what Francis was talking about today in terms of Kennedy's commitment in 1961, it was really and it was done in a totally political context of what do we need to do to beat the Russians. The Russians seem to be beating us. They've got all the boosters. If we were really just going to go to Earth orbiting capabilities, the Russians would probably beat us at that. So we needed a bigger bite. We needed to go out farther. And Kennedy thought maybe it was even going to have to be a Mars mission, but NASA said no, the moon would be big enough. So the two questions together are interesting to study, because why didn't we go back? But it was so extraordinary that we went at all. It would have been just as extraordinary to do it again.
And I'm just going to add one thing on top of that to look, not getting there, but why we haven't been back in some kind of context. If you take away all of those elements that he was just talking about, the war, the international relations, the racial situation in America, all the cultural factors that played a big role in Apollo, and you come forward 50 years and say, why haven't we been back? At the height of Apollo, NASA was getting about 5% of the federal budget. 5%. Today it is a fraction of a percent. And if you want to be a real cynic, you can say, okay, the nation spent in constant year dollars something like $150 billion to go to the moon, and we have 900 pounds of rock. Okay, that's a tough sell in today's environment. So I'm not saying it's not a good reason to go for the science and everything else, but $150 billion and you've got 900 pounds of rock. You go to Congress and try to sell, well, why do we need to go do that again? That's a tough sell.
Well, thank you so much. We're going to end this panel. So thank you to our amazing guests for your presentation and your insight on the Apollo moon landing. We'd also like to thank you, the audience, Dr. May, Angelo State University, and Suddenlink. Next, we will have Tiana Montag, who will present our next speaker, Dr. James Hansen, at 11 a.m. So thank you.
Okay, what's next?
Good morning, everyone. My name is Tiana Montag with the Communication and Mass Media Department. Today we have Dr. James Hansen, who is the author and biographer for the Apollo 11 astronaut Neil Armstrong. This portion of the Apollo seminar is brought to you by Sunlink, our official sponsor. Can you have a round of applause for Dr. Hansen? You may start now.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the sponsor and to all our hosts here at the university. I get to do my favorite thing in the world, and that's to talk about Neil Armstrong. There's lots of different ways to talk about him. One of the reasons that I wanted to write Armstrong's biography, I mean, it was an incredible life story, and not just his time as an astronaut. He had been a test pilot. He'd be a famous person in aerospace history if he had never been an astronaut. He would have become chief test pilot for NASA out at Edwards Air Force Base at the civilian part of that facility. He was a naval aviator who'd flown combat missions in Korea. So his whole life story is worth knowing. And no one he never agreed to have any type of biography written. And so I was very fortunate to get his approval to do it. But beyond what's the obvious in terms of the importance of his story, being the first man to step down onto another heavenly body, it was also, I knew, going to be an iconography, because Armstrong, as soon as he did step down on the Sea of Tranquility, he became a global icon. And the last chapters of the book are all about really his life, as this icon where everybody wanted a piece of him. He was this person that if he were here today, you would all want to touch him. You would all want to have his signature. You'd all want his photograph. You'd want something from him. He died in 2012, so he can't do that for us today. But all the astronauts were heroic in different ways, but no one really achieved the status of icon that Armstrong did. And as a result of being an icon, I think it's true for probably every iconic figure, but certainly it is true for Neil, there were a number of myths that grew up about him, about his life, about his character, about his story. And I knew that part of my job, and I learned it, I didn't know how much myth had been built up until I actually got to talk to him and find out and try to separate the fiction from the fact. And it turned out that there was a lot more that had been exaggerated and a lot more that had been fabricated than I had even imagined. So I want to concentrate today, my subtitle of the talk is Myth Busting the First Man on the Moon. And I'll start with this particular story, which is one of my favorite ones. Neil grew up in Ohio, and as a boy he had lived in a number of different small towns. His father had been an accountant who worked for the state of Ohio as an auditor, and he would basically go from county to county auditing the books of the county. And when he was done with one county, the state sent him off to another town. Usually they were the county seat where the records were kept. And so Neil, as a boy, lived in several different towns. The one that the family ends up in by the time he's high school age is a town called Wapakoneta, which is in northwestern Ohio, kind of south of Toledo. It's a kind of a farming, a town of probably back then in the 40s, 25,000 people, but it was the county seat. And so, there were a lot of Ohio towns that were smaller. So Neil's family moves there, and he spends his high school years in Wapakoneta. In Wapakoneta, there was a man named Jacob Zint. Jacob Zint was a bachelor. He was a very eccentric man. He lived in the house that you see here in the slide. He was kind of Mr. Wizard for Wapakoneta. He was an inventor. He invented all kinds of little devices and machines. He actually was an engineer. He worked for Westinghouse up in Lima, Ohio, which is just to the north of Wapakoneta. And Jacob Zint became kind of a famous person himself in 1969, because as soon as Neil was named the commander of Apollo 11, and it was clear that Apollo 11 was going to be the moon landing, the first attempt at a moon landing, and then announced that Neil would be the first one out of the LEM onto the lunar surface, media from really all around the world came to the little town of Wapakoneta to do feature stories on Neil, his family, his parents, people that knew Neil as a boy, and so forth. And one person that the media heard from was Jacob Zint, and Zint told them the story of how Neil, when he was a Boy Scout, and here you see him over to the left, he became an Eagle Scout, that Neil's Boy Scout group was invited by Mr. Zint to their home, and Mr. Zint at the top of his house had built this astronomical observatory and had a homemade telescope that Mr. Zint had built. And he invited the Boy Scouts up, and he let all the boys, he told them how he built the telescope, and then he let them all look through it. And when the program was over in the Zint home, there was this one boy, blonde, cute little blonde boy, who shyly was sort of waiting around and finally mustered the courage to go up to Mr. Zint and ask him if he could come back. And as Zint told reporters in the summer of 1969, during the moon landing period, it was young Neil Armstrong, and Neil came back many, many times. They looked through the telescope together, and they had these long conversations about not just the moon, but the constellations, and if there was life elsewhere in the universe. And they also shared a love of science fiction novels, so they talked a lot about that. And Mr. Zint even reported to journalists that Neil had sent him a message from Houston saying that when he gets onto the lunar surface that he was going to test out some of the theories that he and Mr. Zint had discussed when Neil was a boy up in the top floor of Mr. Zint's home down the street. Well, of course, this story had made it into all of the children's books, all the children's books about Neil Armstrong that had been published. Of course, I was reading everything that there was ever published about Neil Armstrong as part of my research. So I knew that the Jacob Zint story had become a major story in telling Neil's story of Neil growing up and how he became interested in the heavens. So when I interviewed Neil, and I interviewed him for over 55 hours over many, many months, and I did it sequentially. I talked about his family background, his boyhood, and then moved forward. So I didn't talk about the moon landing for some time. I, of course, wanted to hear more about his relationship with Mr. Zint, because I had all these newspaper clippings that I had cut out and found and Xeroxed and all that kind of stuff. And so I asked him to tell me more about Mr. Zint. Well, as soon as I mentioned Mr. Zint, Neil looks down at the ground, looks up to me. He said, well, it's not true. I said, it's not true. I said, what's not true? Neil said, well, the Boy Scouts did go to his house. He told us about the telescope. He would not let any of us touch the telescope. None of us looked through the telescope. And when we left that evening, I never saw Mr. Zint again. If he'd seen me out on the streets of Wapakoneta, he wouldn't have known even who I was. And I said, Neil, I got all these clippings from Mr. Zint's, and I even knew there was a clipping that when Neil got back from the moon, and this was true for Mike Collins and Buzz Aldrin as well, their hometowns threw parades for them. In Wapakoneta, after the moon landing, there was a parade. The governor of Ohio was there. The famous Hollywood comedian and actor Bob Hope was there, who grew up in Ohio. The Purdue Marching Band was there because Neil had gone to Purdue. And Mr. Zint, I had a story of Mr. Zint with a picture. Mr. Zint had his own open convertible. The city of Wapakoneta was honoring Mr. Zint for the role he had played in cultivating young Neil Armstrong's interest in the heavens. And so how could this not be true? I've got all these stories. Neil said it's just not true. He wanted to be part of the moon landing story, apparently, So I knew from this moment on in my research on the book, and here are some of those children's books. Maybe you have some of them, or you can find them in the bookstores or on Amazon still today. Every one of them tells the Jacob Zint story as if it's true. And what made clear to me that I was going to have to, whatever I had read about Neil, I was going to have to question it. I was going to have to see if it really was true. And there was only one way to know that the Zint story was not true, and that was for Neil to tell me that. And Neil wasn't the type of personality to, he was never going to tell me on his own that, like, Jim, I have to tell you about this man named Jacob Zint. He would never have done that. He only answered the question when I asked him about Mr. Zint. Otherwise, I wouldn't have known about it. You could ask, well, what's so significant about this? Well, as a biographer, someone telling Neil's life story, imagine someone in your own life story telling a story about you that's not at all true, and people come to believe that it is true, and it comes to define for them who you are when it's all based on a lie. Neil, what I have here is a kind of a trajectory. If you have the Zint story that Neil Armstrong was a boy that looked through telescopes all the time and had all these conversations with Jacob Zint and was into science fiction, it seems very reasonable, doesn't it? I mean, because this man became an astronaut, first man on the moon. So you create a trajectory for his life story that goes from that kind of boyhood experience to him becoming an astronaut, landing on the moon. It seems all very logical. That's why nobody would ever, had ever questioned Jacob Zint's story, because, yeah, it seems like that would be what Neil would do. That seems like the kind of boy that Neil would have been since he ended up as an astronaut. The problem is that the Zint story and anything that fed into it or related to it, being false, being a lie, gave you a basis for building a biography that's just not who Armstrong was. Neil wasn't really any of those things that Mr. Zint said that he was. Neil was all about airplanes. Neil was, as a boy, what I call a proto-engineer. Francis French mentioned in his talk today how Neil always considered himself a nerdy pocket protector type of engineer. First and foremost, that was his identity. He was that from the time he was a small boy. He was passionate about building model airplanes, saving his pennies and nickels from every every gift he got, every odd job he did, to go down to the hardware store and buy model kits. And then as he grew older, he got to build gasoline-powered airplanes that could fly, and some later that were even remote control. I tell one story in the book that I think is an interesting one. The picture down here to the right shows you his brother and sister with him sitting in the middle. He had a younger sister, June, a little brother, Dean. And what he would do with some of the models that didn't turn out so well, he would send them through a flight test program. By the time he was like 10 years old, he would have maybe a half a dozen or more airplane models that he would run up with his brother and sister up to the upstairs bedroom window, and he showed them how he wanted them to toss these airplanes out the window. Then he would run down the steps, go outside. He'd have popsicle sticks, and he would, then he'd say, throw the first plane, and he'd have a little notebook. And the plane would come out, and wherever it hit, wherever it glided down to, he'd put a popsicle stick to mark where it landed. And then he would gather them up, take them back up, do it again. So he'd have data. I mean, this is a 10-year-old. He would have data on the airplane's test flights. Neil was a young engineering boy who was passionate about airplanes. He was so passionate that there was a little grass airfield out on the edge of Wapakoneta, and he went out there, rode his bike, and got odd jobs helping to maintain the airplanes, change oil and things like that. And he was then able, at age 16, on his 16th birthday, he got his pilot's license. He had not even tried to drive an automobile yet. He wasn't interested. But he was flying an airplane by the time he was 16. He actually had skipped second grade in one of the towns that they were in because he was such an avid reader. His reading level was so high that when he got to the school and they tested him, they just skipped him over second grade to third. So he was always younger than all of his classmates. And so he started at Purdue, I think, when he was just barely 17. And what he did to go over to freshman orientation is he rented an airplane, an Aeronca Champ, and he flew it from Dayton to West Lafayette, Indiana, and I think he's still 16 at this point when he goes to orientation. And I just have this picture of him landing at the Purdue University airport, landing the plane, and the flight crew comes out and they see this kid who looks like he's 12. And Neil says, gas her up and I'll be back in a few hours. That was the real Neil Armstrong. He was passionate about airplanes. He was an engineer by inclination. He enters Purdue University in the fall of 1947, and he wants to become an aircraft designer. Nothing about space, nothing about astronomy, nothing about science fiction. He's all about airplanes and how they're built and how they perform. This is my favorite picture of Neil. This is after after 2 years of education. He's on a Navy scholarship to Purdue. And after 2 years, he's called to go to Pensacola, Florida, to go to the naval flight training, and he learns to fly planes. And of course, if you're a naval aviator, you're flying off aircraft carriers. So this is a picture of Neil after his first carrier landing in 1950. And you look at that picture of him, and again, he looks like he's 14 years old maybe at this point. But this is the Neil Armstrong, that the Jacobs Ince story doesn't connect with, because that's not the connection. Neil then, in the Navy, goes on. He becomes he was the youngest member of a fighter squadron that flew a jet, one of the first units of Navy jets, the Panther, the F-9F, and he flew 78 combat missions in North Korea. In one of those flights, he has about 6 feet of his port side wing sliced off by a cable that the North Koreans had slung across this low valley. A lot of the activity of the naval units were to come in and bomb bridges and railroad lines and depots and things. So you go down low and then come back up, and Neil got part of his wing cut off and had a hard time controlling the airplane, but was able to keep it airborne until he could eject and get rescued by, he was actually fairly close to a U.S. Marine base, just near the North Korea, South Korea line. So after he ends his 2 years with the Navy in Korea, he goes back to Purdue, finishes his job, gets his degree in aeronautical engineering, takes a job with the agency that precedes NASA. NASA is established in October 1958. This is about a year after the Russian Sputnik, and it's really the reaction to Sputnik, the Sputnik crisis, as historians call it, that stimulated the U.S. Congress to create a new federal agency called NASA. Before NASA, there was something called the NACA, known by its letters, not as, some people call it NACA, but they weren't. In the time, people called it NACA, the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics. And Neil was actually employed by the NACA as soon as he graduated, and he got a job as a test pilot. And he flew first in Cleveland, Ohio, and then a position opened up for him in, oh, that's cool. A position opened up for him, did I do that? A position opened up for him out in California at Edwards Air Force Base, where NACA had a civilian test facility. And you can see from this graphic how many different types of aircraft he flew, how much flying time, how much of it was in jets. And even more significantly, he had experience in the rocket-powered X-15, which was an incredible research aircraft to fly hypersonic speeds, which are supersonic speeds that are like Mach 4, Mach 5, where aerodynamic heating comes into play, and also flying the X-15 at altitudes where you're really getting up into the very fringes of the atmosphere and technically even into space. The very first scene in the movie, if you come to see First Man, or if you've already seen it, is a flight Neil takes in the X-15. It was towed to a certain altitude underneath the wing of a B-52 bomber, and then dropped, and then the rocket would light, and then it would go up to high altitude, and then fall over and fall ballistically and come down to a landing on the desert floor. So Neil made 7 of those flights and before he left the employment. It had become NASA by that point. In 1960, 2, he becomes part of NASA and part of the second group of astronauts. So to compare the trajectory then of the biography that I've written compared to what Jacob Zint's story would have it, you know, you tell the story of a boy who was fascinated with airplanes, with flight, a model builder, a proto-engineer who goes to school, college to be an aircraft designer, you know, who then becomes a combat pilot, who then becomes a test pilot. And it's really not so much, it's not a decision as Neil Armstrong as a boy that he's going to go out into space. And I mean, that was beyond what anybody imagined at the time. You know, what happened with Neil is that he was just in, and this kind of relates to some of the issues we discussed this morning about taking advantage of opportunities when you're there. Neil was just kind of going along with the technology of flight was evolving from propellers to jets to rockets, from subsonic to transonic to supersonic to hypersonic flight, from flight into the atmosphere, in the atmosphere to the edge of the atmosphere to out of the atmosphere and into orbit. And Neil's trajectory in terms of his story went with that technology, with that progress of that technology. So that really is the explanation and the life story that begins his tale and takes us to the moon, really. And this is an important quote from Neil. This was a segment from the 60 Minutes. Some of the CBS guys were involved in the 60 Minutes show that Neil did after my book came out in 2005. And I think this is an important quote that feeds into the trajectory that I've just laid out to you, that, you know, you can read it for yourself, but I'll just go through part of it. His exploration came totally as a byproduct of the progressive development of flight machinery. I flew to the moon not so much to go there, but as part of developing the system that would allow it to happen. So that really gets at the engineering element and what Armstrong really, and also gets to what Francis French was talking about in terms of why the landing that was everything to Armstrong, learning how to land something in the lunar environment. It wasn't just what you do when you walk off a ladder. That wasn't, you know, something that that an engineer had to do. So this gives you a real insight into who he was. So myth busting. I've just sort of gone through it at some length to set up this question of myth that relates to the iconography of Armstrong. And I actually have a fairly long list. I'm not going to be able to go through every one of them. I'll take the time to do what I can. But the very first myth is the myth that young Neil was a stargazer. Well, he wasn't. The Jacob Zint story misleads us completely and has misled other biographers and historians into thinking things about Neil that aren't true. There's a lot about biography that is myth-busting. I think no matter who if you're studying Thomas Edison or Benjamin Franklin or Christopher Columbus or Amelia Earhart, there's going to be people that reach that kind of heroic status or iconic status. You know, there's going to be certain myths that are going to be there, and as a biographer, you need to not just bust them, but understand them. Why are they created? What function did they serve? You know, why do we come to believe them? They play an important role in the overall story. The second myth I have, and I'm not sure everybody speaking here today will agree with, this may be the most contestable of my myths, but there's a book published in the late 70s, The Right Stuff, by Tom Wolfe, one of my most favorite writers. And it's a story of the first group of Mercury astronauts, and even more so, it's a story of test pilot Chuck Yeager, who was the Air Force test pilot who first broke the sound barrier. This, of course, was made into a Hollywood movie in 1984, and maybe some of you have seen The Right Stuff. This is actually a quote. Well, what is the right stuff? You know, it's kind of hard to define. I think this quote from Wolfe's book is the closest thing to to a precise definition that he gives to it. The whole book is kind of an exegesis of what the right stuff really is and who has it. And Wolfe describes it, it's the ability of a pilot to go up in a hurtling piece of machinery and put his hide on the line and have the moxie, the reflexes, the experience, the coolness to pull it back at the last yawning moment
and then to go up again, even if the series should prove infinite, even if you got to keep doing it day after day. So that's the people. Those are the pilots with the right stuff. And as I said, here the movie here was Yeager is played by the actor Sam Shepard. It's a movie that I really love as a movie. It's not great history. The early astronauts themselves found it to be objectionable in a lot of ways. They found it to be a very cartoon caricature of who they were. But again, in terms of what the right stuff amounted to, I have some of the words down at the bottom right. It was pride, unwilling to admit weakness, not given to small talk or introspection, courage, charisma, arrogance, occasional coarseness, competitive nature. Throw that all in a bowl with that other quote you just saw, and pops the person with the right stuff. And if you have read the book or you know the movie, although it's a story of the Mercury original 7 astronauts, the question is who has the right stuff? The right stuff is actually Yeager, who's back at Edwards, back in the desert, sort of forgotten about, didn't want to be one of the astronauts. He probably wouldn't have been chosen to be one of the astronauts because he didn't go to college, or he wasn't the right kind of guy or whatever. He wasn't chosen, but he was really the one, not the 7 original astronauts, but he was really the one that had the right stuff. Well, I have big problems with the right stuff as a concept, because I've done in my own career, I've done a lot of research on engineering, what engineering research in aerospace has been all about. And I actually talk about Armstrong and others who have been test pilots. I talk about the real right stuff. I've given talks on this. This is one I gave out at NASA Dryden, which is now called NASA Armstrong. It was renamed a few years ago. This is that same civilian facility where Neil was a test pilot and flew the X-15. And I think the right stuff, that the real right stuff is something quite different than what Tom Wolfe has explained. And I'll tell you a little story from one of my meetings with Neil in a second, but I just want to say, for me, the real right stuff are the test pilots that are really engineers in the cockpit. They're engineering research test pilots. They're not flying to break records. They're not flying by the seat of their pants. They're not necessarily the characteristics that are being described, in such a bold, exciting way by Tom Wolfe. These guys are out for data. And remember what I said about little Neil Armstrong with his popsicle sticks. They're out for data. They're trying to fly the plane exactly the way the test program has set it up. They're trying to learn about the machine. They're trying to learn about the pilot-machine relationship. They're trying to learn about the machine's performance. They're trying to learn about the environment in which the plane is flying, whether it's supersonic, transonic, hypersonic, or whatever. They're flying very precisely and systematically because they want that data to be reliable. And they're engineers. These are engineers in the cockpit. And these are really the test pilots that have made the biggest contribution to the progress of aeronautics and space over the years. Not the machismo guys that are out trying to just break records. In my view, Chuck Yeager is not the one with the right stuff. You might want to call it the right stuff, but it's not the real right stuff that I think the engineering research pilots have really contributed. Now, for this story, I'm at Armstrong's house, and I'm still talking to him about getting agreement on me writing his biography. And I'm there for the afternoon. It's my first face-to-face meeting with Armstrong. This was 2000 or 2001. The book comes out in 2005 originally. And by that time, I'd done I'd written several books, and I had written a lot about engineering research and development. I'm not an engineer, never took an engineering class, but those just happened to be the books that I ended up writing. So I had studied a lot about how engineers think, how they solve problems. So I'm talking to Neil, and I don't know why I even bring him up, but one of the books that I had done, I had gotten to know a test pilot at NASA Langley Research Center in Virginia named Jack Reeder. And you see Jack right here. And Jack was an engineer from the University of Michigan who went to work for the NAC at Langley in 1943. And he originally was in the wind tunnels. But they needed some more pilots, and during World War II, there were lots of pilots that were needed, over the Pacific or over the Atlantic. And so some of the NAC engineers were sent down for aviation training. Jack went to Pensacola and was trained as a naval aviator, but the whole idea was he was coming back to Langley to be a test pilot. But again, a University of Michigan aeronautical engineering graduate. So I had gotten to know Jack pretty well, and I had learned a lot about what engineering research test pilots did and how they flew and what the real right stuff meant. And I mentioned Jack Reeder to Neil, just casually, Neil stops cold, and his wife, Carol, his second wife, was in the room. She was in and out of the room during our afternoon conversation. And Neil, when I said Jack Reeder, he turned to Carol and said, Jack Reeder was the best test pilot I ever knew. And then he turned back to me, and here's Jack again with his group. This was during a World War II test. He came back and said, and Chuck Yeager was the worst. Now, Neil Armstrong was not the type of person to say bad things or nasty things about other people. In fact, this is the only time I ever remember him saying anything bad about someone. But he said, Jack Reeder was the best test pilot I ever knew. Chuck Yeager was the worst. What you guys are, it's the second part of it that is kind of, whoa, Neil didn't think very highly of Chuck Yeager. In truth, if you read my book, they did know each other and flew together some out at Edwards, and Yeager's opinion of Neil was not good either. I mean, it was kind of mutual dislike, and I try to explain the context of that in the book as much as possible. But for me, what was significant, and I think was significant in Neil's ultimate decision to let me go ahead and write the biography, is I just happened to mention a man. I had no idea that Armstrong knew anything about Jack Reeder. I certainly didn't know that he felt that Jack Reeder was the best test pilot he ever knew. But the fact that I understood why Jack Reeder was such a good test pilot and what he had contributed, the fact that I understood that, I think clinched the deal for me in the biography right then and there, because I had just picked, out of the blue, I had mentioned the person that Neil thought was the best test pilot he ever knew. Jack Reeder had the real right stuff, and Armstrong did too. And Chuck Yeager was a great pilot in many ways, but he wasn't an engineer in the test pilot. He wasn't an engineer in the cockpit. And I think the emphasis upon Yeager and on, quote, the right stuff, and the way it's described in the Tom Wolfe book and in the movie, is just terribly misleading in terms of how the history of technology, of aerospace technology, really developed. So that's the myth of the right stuff. Connected to the myth of the right stuff is what I think is myth number 3, and that is the idea that test pilots and astronauts are so accustomed to death that death didn't bother them. There were an astonishing number of deaths from both groups, especially test pilots. I remember seeing some statistics on the number of test pilots that died out at Edwards and at other facilities in the 50s, and I couldn't believe them. I mean, it's really a number that's unimaginable. And if you're in a career, in a profession where death happens a lot, and maybe you think about medicine as a comparable field where you see death a lot, that people that are around it a lot have to harden themselves to it and get used to it. But the idea that they're so accustomed to death that it doesn't bother them, I think, I don't believe it. And I don't believe it from my own human standpoint. I don't believe it from the history and oral history that I've done. Francis mentioned this morning, and we've mentioned twice now, the deaths of some of the astronauts. Elliot C. and Charlie Bassett at the top were the pilots that were killed in a crash in St. Louis that opened the way for Buzz Aldrin to come in and be part of the Gemini 12 mission. These guys were going to be Gemini 9 astronauts. Then, of course, you've got the Apollo Fire astronauts. And in the movie that you'll see if you come tomorrow night, Elliot C. was one of Neil's best friends, And Ed White was not only one of Neil's best friends, he was Neil's neighbor. And the Whites and the Armstrongs were quite close. And to assume that Neil was so accustomed to the death, or the other astronauts were so accustomed to death given their careers in the military and as test pilots, that deaths just didn't bother them. It is amazing to the degree to which they're able to continue working and doing their jobs properly. But to say that these deaths don't affect them, I think, is part of the myth of the right stuff that needs to be singled out itself. And then there was the personal loss. The movie First Man and the book, in 1962, in January 1962, while Neil was still out at Edwards, his little 2.5-year-old daughter, Karen, dies of a brain tumor. She goes pretty quickly. They try heroically. They tried cobalt radiation, which was a very invasive and nasty radiation treatment to try to stop the cancer growth. The side effects were so terrible. She had learned how to walk. Of course, she died when she was 2.5, but because of the cobalt, she'd lost the ability to walk. It was just horrible. They stopped the cobalt, took her home. She died a few weeks later, and this was a horrible event. It's a tragedy. It's the worst loss. I have a chapter called The Worst Loss. If you know anybody, or maybe you've experienced yourself, the loss of a child is the worst thing that can happen, certainly in a family or to parents. And Neil, this death was certainly traumatic to the Armstrongs. I interviewed, Neil didn't want to say a whole lot about Karen. His nickname for her was Muffy. I did talk to him about her. But his sister June, who you saw in the picture as children, as little ones, June was 2 years younger, and she knew her older brother really well. And June was an amazingly important interview for me in writing the book, because the sister, I'll warn you, the guys in the audience, if you don't want your life story told in detail, don't let the biographer talk to your sister, because the sister is going to tell stories on you that you don't even remember yourself, and things you wouldn't talk about even if you could remember them. But Sister June told me lots and lots of important things about Neil, and she certainly knew about Neil and how heartbreaking. She told me a story that's in the book. I didn't think I'd take the time, but I'm going to take the time. Some months after the death of Karen, Neil and his wife, Janet, and they had a son that had been born before Karen, Rick. They went back to Ohio before Neil took the job and moved to Houston. They went back to Ohio, and of course Neil's grandparents had a farm. He was born in that farmhouse, in fact. And there was the men went out to the barn where there had been a lamb that had died, and the men had to go take care of the dead lamb. And June told me the story how Neil could not go in to the barn because of the death, and that one of the favorite stuffed animals that Karen had was a stuffed baby lamb, and he couldn't go into the barn. So the impact of Karen's death, I looked very carefully, because you just don't assume. And as a biographer, you don't just assume things about people. You've got to try to, research them as best as you can. And this is a tough research question. How much does the death of his child affect him? Well, one thing I did is I looked at his flights, because he went right back to flying. That's how he tried to deal with it. He went right back to flying as soon as he could. And I looked at his flights over the next weeks and months, and he had a series of problematic flights, things that hadn't happened in his career before, that nobody really, and not even Neil, associated with an emotional response to the death of his daughter. But they were happening one after another in the weeks after his. And I think you have to conclude. In fact, when I shared some of this with some of his fellow test pilots that were still living at the time I was writing the book, and some of the people that were at NASA that were hiring Neil, who didn't even know that he had a daughter. I mean, this was kept so private. Neil never talked about it, that there were people that didn't even know that he had a daughter, certainly one that had just died. But what I got back from people when I talked to them about that knew Neil at the time, said, well, he should have been grounded. And in fact, as the movie shows, and my book covers this, the head of the Flight Research Center out at Edwards was seriously considering grounding Neil for a period of time. because of the problem flights that he'd been having in the X-15 and in some other vehicles. So I don't believe that death doesn't affect people. I mean, I think it affects everyone in different ways. With some people, you've got to really look hard because they're not talking about it. And I think with Armstrong, I mean, I talked to people that knew him, say Dave Scott, who was the astronaut that flew with him on Gemini 8. And I talked to him in an interview, and he'd read my book, and he consulted on the movie script as well. And Dave said, I don't think Neil was as bothered by the death of the daughter as you're making him out to be. He never mentioned the daughter to me. Well, duh. There's a reason he doesn't mention the daughter to you. He doesn't mention it to anybody. He doesn't even talk about his death of his daughter with his wife. Why is he going to talk about it with you? So, people who think they know him well and knew him well, there are things about him, just like there are things about you that other people are not ever going to know. They're your secrets. They're your private life, your interior journey. And if, as a biographer, you've got to look really carefully and you've got to talk to a lot of people to sort of get at this, especially when you have a subject like Armstrong who's not going to talk about it much himself. Okay, I've got time for one more myth, and there's a long, long list of things. I mean, I could go on for much longer than you want to be here. But I'll tell you this one. This one's, I think, a significant one. Neil's mother, Viola Armstrong, who you see here holding Neil's picture following Apollo 11, she was a really central figure in his life, as mothers can be. And she was a very religious woman. She was an evangelical Christian, and she read the Bible to the family daily. She made sure that her 3 children said their prayers. Very religious woman. She wrote this article for this Christian magazine, Guideposts, that was published in February 1970, called Neil Armstrong's Boyhood Crisis. And the story that she told was, okay, Neil, I told you, got his pilot's license at age 16. He was also a Boy Scout, an Eagle Scout. Well, one summer, I think he was in the summer of his 17th year, he was born in August, so 17, almost not quite 17. He's in the car with his brother Dean, his dad's driving, a couple other Boy Scouts. They're coming back from a Boy Scout jamboree that was up in northern Ohio. And as they're coming back and they're approaching Wapakoneta, there's a plane coming back into that grass airfield, an Aranca Champ, a little plane trainer, that hits telephone wires and crashes. And Mr. Armstrong, with the boys in the car, they drive to the edge of the airfield. And as this is as told by Viola in her story, Neil gets out of the car first, runs to the boy. It turns out it's a boy a couple years older who's a student pilot who's learning to get his license. And the boy dies in Neil's arms. And Neil goes home. He's in a deep depression. He's not sure whether he should keep flying or not. He stays in his room and doesn't come out. He doesn't build or play with his models. He reads the Bible. He prays. And after about a week of this, according to Viola, Neil comes down to her and says that I've made a decision that God wants me to keep flying. Well, I wanted to ask Neil about that story. Neil said it's not true. His mother was projecting her own religious beliefs onto him. I talked to Neil's sister and brother about this, and they agreed. They remembered the event. And they remembered Mother's writing this story, and they said that's what Mother wants to believe about Neil, but they don't believe that not that he wasn't bothered by it, but that he didn't have this crisis that was a religious crisis, a religious resolution to the crisis. Neil's own religious belief is kind of complicated to discuss. The mother, because he grew up in this very religious household, and I was told stories by the brother and the sister that when Mother talked about religion, Neil would listen. He loved his mother 100%, very, very close to his mother. He just didn't agree with everything about her, about what she believed. When she talked about religion, he would listen politely, not say anything, and walk away. And what's interesting about that personality trait is that that characteristic of Armstrong remains constant through his adulthood, I think until his dying day. I talked to several people that knew him, including mission controllers. Gene Kranz was mission flight director during the landing of Apollo 11. And I asked Gene, I said, did you ever see Neil argue with anybody? He said, no, I really, and I asked a number of people. It became a standard question. Did you ever see Neil argue? Nobody ever saw Neil argue. But they followed up their answer then by saying, it didn't mean he didn't always agree with us, but he just sort of kept it to himself. And then he found his own way. You know, he would then do what he would need to do, you know, not to get his own way, but he just didn't want to argue. Kranz said when they went over the mission rules prior to Apollo 11, that, you know, if this happens, you're going to have to abort, or if that happens, you're going to have to abort. You know, you go over the mission rules. Kranz told me that when they were sitting with the crew for Apollo 11, that as much confidence as they had in Armstrong, he couldn't tell if Armstrong agreed with all the mission rules or not, because he wasn't verbal about it. He wasn't clear. He wasn't saying, I state my agreement. He wasn't stating his agreement. He was listening. And he's kind of an opaque personality, which means you can't really see through him. And so what happened, that personality trait that I think he developed in relationship to his mother, because he didn't agree with her. He loved her, but he didn't agree with her. He wasn't going to argue with her. He was just going to keep his ideas to himself. That personality trait stays constant for the rest of his life. But it does mislead us about his religious belief. I do want to close up by that. There's a story that really connects to it. Yeah, I'll be finishing here in just a couple slides. There's a story that circulates that Neil, in later life, with his wife Carol, his second wife, went to Jerusalem, and on the steps climbing out to the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, he professed his religious belief, and this is the actual story. I won't read it all, but this comes from Tablet magazine, which is another Christian magazine, and it talks about Neil, underline, a devout Christian, and that's this story, if you can look at it quickly, and maybe just the last line I'll read. He said to his host there, I have to tell you, I'm more excited stepping on these stones than I was stepping on the moon. It's as much as you might want to believe that story, it's not a true story. It's a made-up story about Neil. Neil was not a devout Christian. It isn't something that he said. He did visit Jerusalem, but this is not anything that happened. And I have, this was published right after Neil died, but I talked to him about the visit to Jerusalem earlier. This had actually appeared as a story earlier. And I talked to his wife, Carol, who was right next to his side. She said that was never said. This is interesting. This is CBS. You've heard Walter Cronkite's name a few times, CBS CBS host of the nightly evening news. There was a Face the Nation show that happened after the moon landing, and there had been issues of Neil's religious belief that had come up in the weeks leading up to Apollo 11 when all these feature stories were being written about him, and there was a lot of speculation about his religious belief. And Cronkite asked him on Face the Nation, Neil, when you were on the moon, did you feel closer to God? And Neil's answer was, Walter, sometimes a man just wants a good cigar. It wasn't a topic he was going to talk about. It wasn't something where he could just be, not say anything and walk away. But he made it clear he was not going to talk about that subject, and he didn't. There was actually stories, and then it goes farther. There's a story that's been circulating in the Islamic world for many years now that Neil heard the Muslim call to prayer when he was on the lunar surface and didn't know what it was, heard it later when he got back, converted to Islam, and the reason that Neil had become, according to this story, the reason he had become kind of a reclusive personality was that the American government didn't want the world to know that the first man on the moon, this great American astronaut, had converted to Islam. So they were essentially keeping him hidden from view and not letting him go out in the public, which is just total nonsense. Neil did not hear anything. He did not convert to Islam, and he did his best to. He had a press conference, a teleconference with journalists in Cairo, Egypt, in the 1980s. The State Department got involved to try to explain to people, because Neil was getting a lot of invitations to come to mosques and give his discussion of his conversion to Islam. And if you do a Google of Neil Armstrong plus Islam, you'll get hundreds of thousands of hits. It's a story that won't go away, even though I've tried to explain it in my book, and I've discussed it. Neil told me that he was at Purdue visiting his fraternity house for one event, and there was a young student that came up that was from Turkey, that was Muslim, and he came up to Neil and asked about his conversion. And Neil told him, it's not true, it's just a story that circulated. And Neil said to me that the young man said, well, my dad told me you wouldn't be able to tell the truth about it. So even if Neil tried to answer, he couldn't do it. Well, I'm gone a little bit over time. There's many more myths. I'll just say that there were other people that called Neil an atheist. He wasn't that. Neil was a deist. You can look that up. It's somebody who believes in God, that creates the universe, creates the natural laws, but not really a conventional doctrinal Christian in any way, but someone who has. There were lots of deists, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, Benjamin Franklin. There's a lot of deism that comes out of 18th century Enlightenment, rationalism, and Neil really falls into that kind of category. It's a myth that he was a deist, an atheist. He was a deist. Just some of the myths that are there that people still think are true in many cases that aren't. So, thank you. Is there time for a question, or have I taken up? There's no time even for a question. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hans, for your presentation. We also like to thank the audience, Dr. May, Angelo State University, and Suddenlink. We will be having a book signing with Dr. Hansen and Francis French right outside the UC at 1:15. If you don't have your book, they're still available in the bookstore. Also, there are still tickets available for the movie First Man, generously sponsored by Suddenlink. Tomorrow at 6:20 at Icon Theater. There will also be a Q&A after the movie with Dr. Hansen. Tickets are limited, so please go get yours now. They're on the 3rd floor of the library, room B309. Thank you.